There is a place where the world forgets itself, where the boundaries between memory and myth dissolve like salt in endless water, where the very notion of beginning becomes as fluid as the tides that have swept across our planet for longer than any human can truly comprehend. Beneath the waves that crash upon our shores, beneath the depths that explorers have only begun to touch, there may lie a secret so profound that it changes everything we thought we knew about who we are and where we came from. Imagine for a moment that the story of humanity did not begin in the dusty river valleys we read about in textbooks, not in the familiar narratives of Mesopotamia or Egypt or the Indus Valley, but somewhere else entirely. Somewhere now lost beneath miles of dark water. Somewhere that calls to us still in dreams and ancient stories that refuse to die. This is not simply a tale of ruins beneath the sea or scattered artifacts that divers occasionally discover. This is the possibility that our first true civilization, the one that taught us to think and build and dream beyond survival, did not fall to invaders or drought or disease, but sank beneath waves that rose to claim it, leaving behind only whispers and fragments, and a haunting sense that something important has been forgotten. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let your mind drift towards sleep, we invite you on a journey to explore this possibility, to dive deep into the mystery of whether the first great human civilization met its end, not on land but in water, not through conquest but through catastrophe, not by falling but by sinking into the embrace of an ocean that keeps its secrets well. The question that haunts us begins with a simple observation that has troubled historians and archaeologists for generations. When we look at the earliest civilizations we know about, the ones that left behind monuments and writing and complex social structures, we find them appearing suddenly, almost impossibly quickly, as if they emerged fully formed with knowledge that should have taken centuries to develop. The ancient Egyptians knew things about mathematics and astronomy and engineering that seemed to defy the timeline we have constructed for human development. The Sumerians appeared with a complete writing system and sophisticated understanding of agriculture and law that suggests they did not simply invent these things from scratch, but perhaps inherited them from somewhere else. The mysterious builders of Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey constructed massive stone temples over 11,000 years ago, long before humans were supposed to be capable of such organized effort, long before we thought civilization itself was possible. These facts create a puzzle that conventional explanations struggle to solve completely. What if the answer lies not in the places we have been looking, but in the places we cannot easily reach beneath waters that have risen dramatically since the last ice age ended, covering vast stretches of coastline where ancient peoples might have built their greatest cities and developed their most advanced knowledge? The ocean holds more history than all the museums in the world combined. Every shoreline on Earth has changed dramatically over the last 20,000 years, shifting and transforming as ice sheets melted and sea levels rose by more than 400 feet in some regions, drowning what would have been prime real estate for early human settlements. The people of the Ice Age were not primitive cave dwellers living in the frozen wasteland we often imagine. They were humans exactly like us, with the same brain capacity and creative potential, living in a world that looked completely different from the one we know today. The coastlines they knew stretched far beyond where our beaches end now, revealing continental shelves that were dry land, creating entire landscapes that have since disappeared beneath the waves. These drowned lands were not barren or undesirable. They would have been among the most attractive places for humans to settle, offering access to both marine resources and inland areas, providing moderate climates and abundant food sources, creating the perfect conditions for populations to grow and cultures to develop. If you wanted to find where humans would naturally build their first complex societies, you would look precisely at the kinds of coastal zones that are now deep underwater, lost to us except through the most dedicated underwater archaeology efforts that are only beginning to reveal how much we have missed. Consider the story of Doggerland, a name that sounds like fiction but describes a real place that existed between Britain and continental Europe during the Ice Age. Doggerland was not a small strip of land, but an enormous territory, roughly the size of modern England, connecting the British Isles to France and Germany, and creating a vast lowland paradise that would have been one of the most densely populated regions of prehistoric Europe. Archaeological evidence dragged up by fishing boats and discovered by marine surveys shows that Doggerland was home to thriving communities of humans who hunted and gathered across its rivers and hills and forests. Then, as the Ice Age ended and temperatures warmed, the sea began to rise, slowly at first, but then with increasing speed, drowning this entire world over the course of several thousand years. The people who lived there did not simply vanish. They were forced to migrate, to move inland, to abandon everything they had built in the lowlands and start over on higher ground. But what if Doggerland was not unique? What if similar drowned landscapes exist off the coasts of every continent, hiding the remains of settlements and cultures that we have never accounted for in our understanding of human history? What if the most advanced of these lost lands was not merely a collection of hunter-gatherer camps, but something far more sophisticated, a true civilization that developed in the favorable conditions of the coastal zones and then disappeared beneath the rising waters, leaving only the faintest traces for us to find? The legends tell us something that science is only now beginning to take seriously. Every culture around the world has flood myths, stories of great inundations that destroyed previous civilizations, tales of lost golden ages when people knew more and lived better before catastrophe struck. The story of Atlantis is the most famous, described by the Greek philosopher Plato as an advanced island civilization that sank beneath the waves in a single day and night of misfortune. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as pure fiction, a moral tale invented to make philosophical points about hubris and divine justice. But Plato insisted that his account was based on actual history, passed down through Egyptian priests who kept records going back thousands of years before Greek civilization even existed. He provided specific details about the location and layout and customs of Atlantis with the precision of someone describing a real place, not making up a fantasy. Whether or not Plato's Atlantis existed exactly as he described it, the persistence of these flood legends across completely separate cultures suggests that they preserve some memory of real events. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia tell stories of times when the coastline extended far beyond where it is now, describing specific locations that are now underwater, with details that match what marine archaeology has discovered. Indigenous peoples along the Pacific coast of North America have oral traditions describing the flooding of coastal areas that geological evidence confirms actually happened. In India, there are ancient texts that speak of a great kingdom called Kumari Kandam that was swallowed by the sea, and sure enough, marine surveys have found evidence of submerged structures off the southern coast of India that some researchers believe could be remnants of human construction from many thousands of years ago. The question becomes not whether ancient civilizations were affected by rising seas, because clearly they were, but rather how advanced these civilizations might have been before the waters claimed them. The conventional view of prehistory places the development of true civilization in a narrow window beginning only about 6,000 years ago, with anything before that relegated to the category of primitive hunter-gatherers who left behind only simple stone tools and cave paintings. But this view has been challenged repeatedly by archaeological discoveries that push the timeline of human sophistication further and further back into the past. Göbekli Tepe, discovered in Turkey in the 1990s, changed everything by proving that humans were building massive ceremonial complexes out of precisely carved stones, weighing many tons each, at a time when we thought they were barely capable of settling in one place. The site dates to 11,000 years ago, making it twice as old as Stonehenge and contemporary with the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were rising rapidly. If humans could accomplish this in the highlands of Turkey, What might they have accomplished along the fertile coasts that are now drowned? The logical assumption is that coastal peoples, with access to abundant food resources and easier transportation by boat, would have been at least as advanced, if not more so, than the inland peoples who built places like Göbekli Tepe. But we cannot easily study these coastal cultures because their remains lie beneath hundreds of feet of water, protected from archaeological investigation by the sheer difficulty and expense of underwater exploration. The technology of underwater archaeology has advanced dramatically in recent decades, giving us new tools to search for these lost worlds. Yet we have barely begun to explore the vast underwater landscapes that could hold evidence of prehistoric civilizations. Sonar mapping of the ocean floor has revealed surprising features that appear too regular to be entirely natural, including what seem to be terraced formations and straight lines and geometric patterns in locations that were above water during the Ice Age. Off the coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, divers have documented a massive stone formation that features what appear to be carved steps and platforms and right-angle corners that some researchers believe must be the work of human hands, though others argue it could be an unusual natural formation shaped by erosion and geological forces. The debate over Yonaguni continues, but even skeptics admit that the formation is remarkable and deserves further study. Similar controversial structures have been reported off the coasts of India, Cuba, and the Bahamas, each case sparking fierce arguments between those who see evidence of ancient construction and those who insist the formations are natural. What makes these debates so difficult is that underwater sites are incredibly hard to excavate properly, requiring expensive equipment and trained divers and favourable conditions that allow detailed examination. Unlike land-based archaeology, where researchers can carefully expose layers of soil and document every artifact in place, underwater archaeology often amounts to looking at formations through murky water and trying to decide whether what you are seeing is natural rock or human construction, without being able to conduct the kind of thorough investigation that would settle the question definitively. The hypothesis that a sophisticated civilization might have existed during the Ice Age and been drowned by rising seas is not wild speculation pulled from thin air, but rather an attempt to explain several puzzling aspects of the archaeological record that conventional theories struggle with. One of the most persistent puzzles is the question of how knowledge and technology spread so rapidly across the ancient world once civilizations began appearing in the historical record. When we examine early civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley in China, we find them using similar techniques for agriculture and irrigation and construction, developing comparable forms of social organization and religious practice, creating writing systems and mathematical concepts that show remarkable parallels even though these civilizations were separated by thousands of miles and supposedly developed independently. The standard explanation is that these similarities arose because humans everywhere face similar challenges and tend to solve them in similar ways, which is certainly true to some extent, but the speed and sophistication of these early civilizations suggests they might have been building on a foundation of knowledge that already existed, rediscovering or adapting techniques that had been developed earlier by a predecessor culture that was itself lost to history. If there had been an advanced coastal civilization during the Ice Age, one that had already figured out the basics of agriculture and construction and social organization, then survivors of that civilization fleeing the rising seas could have carried their knowledge inland, seeding the later civilizations we know about with ideas and technologies that would otherwise have taken much longer to develop. The process by which sea level rose at the end of the Ice Age was not gentle or gradual in human terms, even though it played out over thousands of years in geological terms. There were periods when the melting of ice sheets caused rapid pulses of sea level rise, catastrophic events that would have drowned coastal areas within a few generations, perhaps even within a single lifetime in some cases. One such event, known to geologists as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred about 14,000 years ago and caused sea levels to rise by more than 50 feet in just a few centuries, an astonishing rate of change that would have been devastating to any coastal populations. Another pulse occurred around 8,000 years ago when the final collapse of the North American ice sheet sent massive amounts of meltwater into the oceans, raising sea levels again and flooding coastal regions that had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. These were not abstract geological events, but human catastrophes of unimaginable scale, forcing entire populations to abandon their homes and move to higher ground, disrupting trade networks and cultural connections, destroying the accumulated knowledge and infrastructure of countless generations. Imagine living in a coastal city today and being told that within your lifetime the ocean will rise 50 feet, submerging everything you know, forcing you and everyone you love to flee inland with only what you can carry. This is what happened to our ancestors, not once but multiple times as the Ice Age ended and the world transformed around them. The emotional impact of these floods would have been profound and lasting. These were not distant memories or abstract historical events for the people who experienced them, but defining traumas that shaped their worldview and their stories. When your entire world drowns, when the cities where your ancestors lived for generations disappear beneath the waves, when the temples and markets and homes that formed the backdrop of your life vanish underwater, you do not simply forget. You tell stories about what happened. You warn your children and grandchildren about the danger of the sea. You preserve the memory of what was lost, even as the details fade and transform over the generations into myth and legend. This is likely the origin of the flood stories that appear in so many ancient cultures. Not abstract moral tales, but genuine historical memories passed down through oral tradition, distorted over time, but preserving the essential truth that the sea once rose and destroyed the world that came before. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written stories in existence, includes a detailed flood narrative that closely parallels the biblical story of Noah, suggesting both drew from even older sources. In this ancient Sumerian tale, a man is warned by the gods that a great flood is coming and instructed to build a boat to save himself and the animals. Eerily similar to flood stories found in cultures as distant as ancient Greece and indigenous America and Polynesia. The fact that these stories appear independently in cultures separated by vast oceans and thousands of miles suggests they are not borrowed from one another but rather reflect a common human experience, a shared memory of catastrophic flooding that affected people around the entire world as the Ice Age ended. The survivors of these floods would have carried more than just memories. They would have brought whatever knowledge and skills they possessed, whatever technologies and techniques they had developed in their drowned homeland, adapting them to their new circumstances and passing them on to future generations. This could explain why we find evidence of sophisticated knowledge appearing seemingly out of nowhere in multiple locations around the world roughly 10,000 to 6,000 years ago. The agricultural revolution, once thought to have originated in a single location in the Fertile Crescent and then spread slowly across the world, is now known to have occurred independently in at least 7 different locations, including China and Mexico and New Guinea and Africa, all within a relatively brief period of time. This remarkable synchronicity has puzzled researchers for decades. How did people in such widely separated locations all figure out agriculture at roughly the same time, developing similar techniques for domesticating plants and animals despite having no apparent contact with one another? One possibility is that the knowledge was not invented independently, but rather inherited from an earlier culture that had already mastered these techniques, a culture that was then destroyed by rising seas, scattering its survivors and their knowledge across multiple continents where they taught the local populations what they knew, sparking agricultural revolutions in various locations simultaneously. The question of what a drowned Ice Age civilization might have looked like leads us to consider what kinds of structures and technologies they might have possessed. We tend to assume that ancient peoples lacked the knowledge and tools to build anything very impressive. but the archaeological record contradicts this assumption again and again. The Great Pyramids of Egypt were built over 4,000 years ago using techniques that modern engineers still struggle to fully understand. Moving stones weighing many tons each with precision that would be challenging even with modern equipment. The massive stones of Baalbek in Lebanon, some weighing over 800 tons, were quarried and positioned with such skill that we cannot entirely explain how it was done. The intricate drainage systems of the Indus Valley civilization, the precisely aligned temples of ancient Malta, the enormous stone heads of Easter Island all demonstrate that ancient peoples were capable of remarkable feats of engineering and organization. If civilizations from 6,000 or 4,000 or even 2,000 years ago could accomplish these things, what might a civilization from 12,000 or 15,000 years ago have achieved? Especially if they had been developing continuously for many generations without the disruptions of war and conquest that plagued later societies. A coastal civilization would have had certain natural advantages that might have accelerated their development. Access to the ocean meant access to abundant food resources, including fish and shellfish that required less effort to obtain than hunting large game on land. Seafood provides high-quality protein and essential fatty acids that support brain development, potentially giving coastal populations a nutritional advantage that could have enhanced their cognitive abilities. The ocean also provided transportation, allowing boats to move goods and people much more easily than overland travel, facilitating trade and the exchange of ideas across distances that would have been prohibitively difficult to traverse on foot. Coastal areas tend to have moderate climates, protected from the extreme heat and cold of continental interiors, creating more comfortable living conditions and longer growing seasons. All of these factors would have made coastal zones ideal for population growth and cultural development, creating the conditions where a sophisticated civilization could emerge much earlier than we typically imagine. The problem, of course, is that these ideal coastal zones are now underwater, taking with them any evidence of what might have been built there, leaving us to speculate based on the fragments that remain and the legends that refuse to die. Some researchers have suggested that if an advanced Ice Age civilization existed, it might have been primarily a maritime culture, one that focused on the sea rather than the land, developing technologies related to boats and fishing and navigation rather than agriculture and animal husbandry. Such a civilization might have left relatively few traces on land because they spent most of their time on or near the water, building their cities and ports along coastlines that are now deep beneath the waves. A maritime culture could have spread across vast distances, establishing trading posts and colonies on different continents, creating a network of connected communities that shared knowledge and technology across the ancient world. This would explain the puzzling similarities between distant ancient cultures, the shared architectural techniques and astronomical knowledge and religious symbolism that appear in civilizations that supposedly had no contact with one another. If a single maritime civilization had visited and influenced multiple coastlines during the Ice Age, teaching local populations their knowledge and skills, then the later emergence of similar civilizations in these various locations would make much more sense, representing not independent invention, but the reawakening of knowledge that had been planted thousands of years earlier by visitors from the sea. The concept of a lost maritime civilization connects intriguingly with another mystery of prehistory, the question of how humans managed to populate the entire world so quickly and so thoroughly. By the end of the Ice Age, humans had reached every continent except Antarctica, settling in environments ranging from tropical islands to Arctic tundra, crossing vast stretches of open ocean to reach remote Pacific islands, somehow navigating thousands of miles of open water without any of the instruments or technologies we associate with seafaring. The conventional explanation is that these migrations happened gradually over tens of thousands of years, with people island hopping and following coastlines, and occasionally getting blown off course by storms to discover new land by accident. But some researchers suggest that ancient peoples might have been much more sophisticated navigators than we give them credit for. possessing knowledge of currents and stars and seasonal patterns that allowed them to deliberately explore and settle distant lands. If there had been an advanced maritime civilization during the Ice Age, they might have charted the oceans and established trade routes, and developed navigation techniques that were later lost when their civilization sank, only to be slowly rediscovered by later cultures who found themselves back at the beginning, having to relearn skills that their distant ancestors had already mastered. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence for ancient advanced knowledge comes not from underwater archaeology, but from maps. There exists a collection of very old maps that show details of coastlines and continents that should have been impossible for the mapmakers of their time to know. The most famous is the Piri Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, which shows not only Europe and Africa and South America with remarkable accuracy, but also appears to depict the coastline of Antarctica, even though Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, over 300 years later. The map shows Antarctica without its ice cover, revealing what the actual coastline beneath the ice looks like, something that modern science only confirmed through deep radar surveys in the 1950s. Piri Reis himself noted on the map that he had compiled it from much older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier. This raises a fascinating question. Who made the original maps that Piri Reis copied, and how did they have such accurate knowledge of Antarctica's ice-free coastline, something that would have been visible only in the very distant past before the ice sheets formed? Other ancient maps show similar anomalies. The Orontius Venneus map from 1531 shows Antarctica centered on the South Pole with rivers and mountains drawn in detail, again suggesting knowledge of what the continent looks like beneath its ice. The Buache map from 1737 shows Antarctica as two separate islands, which is exactly what modern research has revealed it to be beneath the connecting ice sheet. Various medieval and Renaissance maps show coastlines and islands that are in the correct positions but were supposedly unknown to Europeans at the time the maps were made. The standard explanation is that these maps are simply wrong, that the apparent matches with reality are coincidences, or that the cartographers were making educated guesses, or copying errors from earlier maps that happen to look like real features by accident. But this explanation starts to strain credibility when you have multiple different maps from different time periods, all showing similar details that happen to match what we now know to be true. An alternative explanation is that these maps were indeed copied from much older source materials, maps that dated back to a time when Antarctica was not yet covered in ice, when someone with advanced knowledge of geography and navigation had charted the world's coastlines and islands with impressive accuracy. If such source maps existed, they would have been created at least 6,000 years ago, probably much longer, long before any civilization we know about possessed the technology to undertake such comprehensive mapping efforts. The mystery deepens when we consider the sophisticated astronomical knowledge demonstrated by ancient cultures. The builders of the pyramids oriented their structures with extraordinary precision to true north and incorporated mathematical relationships that reflect their understanding of the Earth's dimensions. The ancient Mayans calculated the length of the solar year to within seconds of the modern measurement, and predicted eclipses with remarkable accuracy using complex mathematical systems. The stone circles and astronomical monuments found across Europe and the Middle East show that their builders understood the movements of the sun and moon and stars well enough to track them precisely and predict astronomical events years in advance. The Hindu Vedas contain descriptions of cosmic timescales that match modern scientific understanding of the age of the universe with uncanny accuracy, speaking of cycles lasting millions and billions of years at a time when most cultures thought the world was only a few thousand years old. How did these ancient peoples acquire such sophisticated knowledge? The conventional answer is that they figured it out through careful observation over many generations, which is certainly possible, but it also requires us to assume that they invested enormous amounts of time and effort into making astronomical observations and calculations that had no obvious practical benefit for their daily survival. An alternative possibility is that this knowledge was inherited from an earlier civilization that had already done the work of cataloguing the heavens, passing down their discoveries through traditions and texts that later cultures preserved even if they did not fully understand where the knowledge originally came from. While most of the ocean floor remains unexplored, the few underwater archaeological discoveries that have been made hint at how much history might be hidden beneath the waves. Off the coast of India near the city of Dwarka, marine archaeologists have found extensive stone structures submerged in about 100 feet of water, including what appear to be walls and buildings and streets arranged in a pattern that suggests organized urban planning. The structures date to at least several thousand years old, possibly much older, and seem to match ancient descriptions of Dwarka as a great city that was eventually swallowed by the sea. In the Mediterranean, dozens of ancient ports and harbours have been discovered underwater, submerged by the gradual rising of sea level and the sinking of coastlines over thousands of years. The ancient port of Alexandria in Egypt now lies mostly underwater, with divers exploring the remains of buildings and statues and artifacts from the time of Cleopatra. Off the coast of Greece, researchers have found the remains of Pavlopetri, an entire Bronze Age town complete with streets and houses and tombs, dating back over 5,000 years and preserved remarkably well beneath the waters that claimed it. These discoveries prove that significant settlements can and do end up underwater, and they give us a glimpse of what we might find if we could explore more of the submerged coastlines that have been inaccessible until now. The challenge of underwater archaeology cannot be overstated. Water absorbs light quickly, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in most ocean conditions. Currents and tides stir up sediment that clouds the water further. The pressure of deep water makes it impossible for human divers to reach many sites without specialized equipment. Underwater environments are harsh on archaeological remains, with saltwater corroding metal and organic materials decomposing much faster than they would on land. Structures built of wood or mud brick or other perishable materials would leave little trace after thousands of years underwater, meaning that only stone constructions would have any chance of surviving in recognizable form. This creates a significant bias in what we can find. A civilization that built primarily with wood, which would have been the logical choice for a maritime culture, might have left almost no trace for us to discover, while a much less sophisticated culture that happened to build in stone might leave impressive ruins that survive for millennia. When we search for evidence of lost civilizations underwater, we are really only finding the civilizations that happen to build in durable materials and happen to be located in areas we have explored, which represents a tiny fraction of the drowned landscapes that exist. Some of the most controversial underwater discoveries have been largely ignored by mainstream archaeology because they are too anomalous, too difficult to fit into the established timeline of human development. The Gulf of Cambay structures off the coast of India appear to include large geometric formations and what look like building remains at depths of over 100 feet, in an area that would have been dry land only at the end of the Ice Age, suggesting they could be much older than conventional archaeology would allow. Expeditions have recovered artifacts from the site, including pottery and beads and pieces of worked wood that have been carbon dated to around 9,000 years old, making them older than the Sumerian civilization and contemporary with Göbekli Tepe. The discovery generated significant media attention when it was first announced, but subsequent expeditions have struggled to confirm the findings conclusively, in part because the site is difficult to work in due to poor visibility and strong currents. The controversy surrounding the Gulf of Cambay structures reflects a broader problem in underwater archaeology. Sites that challenge conventional understanding of prehistory are held to much higher standards of proof than sites that fit comfortably within the established narrative, meaning that evidence for very ancient civilizations has to be virtually indisputable to be accepted. while evidence that supports the traditional timeline can be accepted on much more modest grounds. If an advanced civilization did exist during the Ice Age and was destroyed by rising seas, how would we know about it now? The answer lies in oral traditions, the stories that cultures pass down from generation to generation, preserving memories that might otherwise be lost. Before writing was invented, oral tradition was the only way to maintain knowledge across time, and many cultures developed sophisticated techniques for memorizing and transmitting information accurately. Indigenous Australian cultures have oral traditions that have been maintained continuously for over 10,000 years, including stories that describe specific geographical features and events that have been confirmed by modern science. The Aboriginal peoples of the Australian coast tell stories about times when the ocean was much lower and you could walk to islands that are now separated by miles of water. When researchers investigated these stories, they found that Aboriginal oral traditions accurately describe the geography of areas that have been underwater for over 7,000 years, proving that these stories had been passed down faithfully through hundreds of generations, preserving real memories of a time when the world was very different. The precision with which oral traditions can preserve information over vast time spans has been demonstrated in multiple cultures. In the Pacific Northwest, Indigenous peoples tell stories of a great earthquake and tsunami that devastated the coast, describing details of the event with specificity that allowed modern researchers to date the earthquake to January 1700 and link it to Japanese historical records that documented a tsunami arriving from across the Pacific on that same date. In New Zealand, Maori oral traditions describe the arrival of their ancestors on great voyaging canoes hundreds of years ago, providing details about the journey and the explorers and the places they visited that have been confirmed by archaeological and genetic evidence. In Iceland, the sagas written down in the Middle Ages preserve detailed memories of events and people from the Viking Age hundreds of years earlier, maintaining accurate genealogies and descriptions of historical events that have been verified through other sources. These examples prove that oral tradition is not merely mythology or fantasy, but can serve as a genuine historical record, capable of preserving important information across many centuries or even millennia. If oral traditions can accurately remember events from 7,000 or 10,000 years ago, as the Aboriginal examples demonstrate, then the flood myths and legends of lost civilizations found in cultures around the world might similarly preserve real memories of events from the end of the Ice Age, distorted and embellished over time, but retaining a core of historical truth. The process by which historical events transform into myths and legends is well understood. Real events are remembered and retold, but with each retelling, small details change. The story is adapted to fit the cultural context of the listeners. Supernatural elements are added to make the story more dramatic or to explain aspects that are no longer understood. Over many generations, an account of a real flood that destroyed coastal settlements can transform into a story about gods punishing humanity, or a tale about a hero who survived through divine intervention. But the core memory remains. There was a great flood. It destroyed the world that existed before. Some people survived and had to start over. This is exactly the pattern we see in flood myths around the world. The details vary enormously from culture to culture, but the essential elements are consistent. There was once a time when people lived differently. A great flood came and destroyed that world. A few survivors escaped and became the ancestors of the current population. These stories are too widespread and too consistent in their core elements to be dismissed as pure fantasy. They point to something real, some shared experience that affected human populations across the globe at roughly the same time period, which matches exactly what we know happened at the end of the Ice Age, when rising seas drowned coastal areas on every continent. The sudden appearance of agriculture in multiple locations around the world remains one of the great mysteries of prehistory. For millions of years, humans and their ancestors survived as hunter-gatherers, a lifestyle that was actually quite successful and required less work than farming. Hunter-gatherers typically enjoyed better nutrition, better health, and more leisure time than early agricultural peoples, who suffered from diseases related to living in crowded settlements and had to work harder to produce their food. Yet despite these disadvantages, agriculture was independently invented in multiple locations around the world within a relatively brief period, roughly 10,000 to 8,000 years ago. In the Fertile Crescent, people began cultivating wheat and barley and domesticating sheep and goats. In China, they domesticated rice and pigs. In Mexico, they cultivated corn and beans. In South America, they grew potatoes and quinoa. In New Guinea, they developed agriculture based on yams and bananas. In Africa, they domesticated sorghum and millet. Each of these agricultural systems was based on completely different plants and animals, adapted to completely different environments, yet all emerged at roughly the same time. This timing is suspicious. If agriculture was such a difficult innovation that took millions of years for humans to figure out, why did it suddenly appear in 7 or 8 different places almost simultaneously? The conventional explanation for the agricultural revolution is that climate change at the end of the Ice Age created conditions that favored the development of farming. As the climate warmed and became more stable, wild plants that could be cultivated became more abundant, and human populations began to settle down and experiment with growing their own food rather than constantly moving to follow wild game. This explanation makes sense on the surface, but it does not fully account for why agriculture appeared so suddenly and so widely. Climate change affected the entire world, but it was gradual, taking place over thousands of years, which should have led to agriculture developing slowly and spreading gradually from one region to others. Instead, we see agriculture appearing independently in multiple locations separated by thousands of miles at almost the same time, as if something triggered people in all these different places to suddenly start farming even though they had no contact with one another. One possible explanation is that the knowledge of agriculture had existed before, developed by a lost civilization that mastered plant and animal domestication during the Ice Age. When that civilization was destroyed by rising seas, its survivors scattered to different parts of the world, carrying with them the knowledge of farming. In each location where they settled, they taught the local populations how to cultivate plants and domesticate animals, adapting the techniques to whatever species were available locally. This would explain why agriculture appears independently in so many places at roughly the same time, why it involves similar concepts and techniques even though the specific crops and animals are completely different, and why it happened so suddenly after millions of years of humans living perfectly well without it. The domestication of plants and animals is not a simple or obvious process. It requires many generations of careful selection and breeding to transform wild species into useful domestic varieties. Wild wheat, for example, shatters its seeds when ripe, scattering them on the ground, which is good for the plant because it spreads its seeds, but bad for humans because it makes the seeds hard to harvest. Domestic wheat has been bred to retain its seeds when ripe, a trait that would never evolve naturally because it prevents the plant from reproducing effectively in the wild. Creating this trait required ancient farmers to identify rare individual plants that happen to retain their seeds, save those seeds, and replant them. Repeat this process for many generations until the trait became dominant, all while maintaining enough genetic diversity to keep the plants healthy. This is sophisticated selective breeding that requires long-term planning and understanding of heredity, not something that primitive people would stumble upon by accident. Similarly, the domestication of animals required identifying which wild animals had the temperament and characteristics that would make them useful as livestock, capturing and breeding them, selecting for traits like docility and productivity over many generations. Wolves do not naturally turn into domestic dogs. Wild boars do not naturally become domestic pigs. These transformations required deliberate effort over hundreds or thousands of years, carried out by people who understood what they were trying to achieve and had the knowledge and patience to see it through. If this knowledge came from a single source, a lost civilization that had already figured out the principles of selective breeding, then it could have been applied to different species in different regions, producing the multiple independent agricultural revolutions we observe in the archaeological record. The massive stone structures of prehistory pose another puzzle that the lost civilization hypothesis helps to explain. Around the world, we find evidence of people building with enormous stones, moving and placing blocks weighing tens or even hundreds of tons with precision that would be challenging even with modern equipment. The Great Pyramids of Egypt are the most famous example, but they are far from unique. At Stonehenge in England, builders transported massive stones over 100 miles and erected them in precise astronomical alignments. At Karnak in France, thousands of standing stones were arranged in long rows stretching for miles. In Malta, prehistoric temples were built using stones weighing many tons, precisely carved and fitted together. In Peru, the fortress of Sacsayhuaman features massive stones cut and fitted so precisely that you cannot slide a knife blade between them. In Lebanon, the stones of Baalbek include some weighing over 1,000 tons, making them the largest work stones ever used in construction. In Easter Island, massive stone heads weighing up to 80 tons were carved and transported across the island. All of these structures date to different time periods and were built by different cultures, yet they share a common feature: the use of enormous stones placed with precision that seems to exceed what should have been possible with the technology available at the time. The mainstream explanation for how these structures were built involves large numbers of workers using simple tools and clever techniques to move and place the stones. For the pyramids, the theory is that thousands of workers drag the stones up ramps using ropes and sledges, gradually building the pyramid layer by layer over many years. For Stonehenge, the idea is that the stones were moved using wooden rollers and sledges, pulled by teams of people over the long distance from the quarry to the construction site. These explanations are certainly possible, and experimental archaeology has shown that large stones can be moved using these methods. But the scale and precision of many ancient structures still seems to exceed what should have been achievable. The stones of the pyramids are placed with tolerances measured in fractions of an inch. The astronomical alignments are accurate to tiny fractions of a degree. The precision with which stones are carved and fitted together suggests the use of advanced tools and techniques that we do not see evidence for in the archaeological record. This creates a puzzle. Either ancient peoples were far more skilled and organized than we give them credit for, using simple tools to achieve results that amaze us even with modern technology, or they had access to knowledge and techniques that have been lost, possibly inherited from an earlier civilization that had already figured out how to work with massive stones and passed that knowledge down to later cultures. One of the most interesting aspects of these megalithic structures is that many of them were built on or near the coast, in locations that would have been even more central to coastal trade and settlement during times of lower sea level. The temples of Malta are on islands that were connected to a larger land mass during the Ice Age. Stonehenge is relatively near the ancient coastline, and Britain itself was connected to Europe by Doggerland during lower sea levels. Many of the mysterious stone structures in South America are in coastal regions or on islands. This pattern suggests a connection between megalithic building traditions and maritime cultures, as if the knowledge of how to work with massive stones was associated with people who lived by and travelled on the sea. If there had been an advanced maritime civilization during the Ice Age, they might have developed techniques for moving and placing large stones, perhaps for use in constructing ports and harbours and coastal defences. When rising seas destroyed their civilization, the survivors who reached different parts of the world might have brought this knowledge with them, teaching local populations how to build with megalithic stones even if the specific purpose and context of the original techniques were lost. This would explain why megalithic construction appears in so many different places, why the structures often share similar features despite being built by supposedly unrelated cultures, and why the building techniques seem to exceed what we would expect from peoples who were just beginning to develop civilization. Pyramids present their own special mystery. The pyramid shape appears independently in multiple ancient civilizations that supposedly had no contact with one another. Egypt has its famous pyramids at Giza and elsewhere. Mexico and Central America have pyramids built by the Mayans and Aztecs and earlier cultures. South America has pyramids, including some of the largest in the world by volume. China has pyramids, though many have been covered by earth and vegetation over the centuries. Indonesia has recently discovered what appears to be a very ancient pyramid at Gunung Padang, possibly the oldest megalithic structure in the world. Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt, built by the ancient Nubian civilization. Even North America had pyramid-like mounds built by indigenous cultures. The pyramid shape is architecturally stable and practical for building large structures with primitive technology, which helps explain why it appears in multiple places, but the similarities go deeper than just the basic shape. Many pyramid complexes around the world show similar features. They are aligned to astronomical phenomena. They served religious and ceremonial purposes. They were associated with beliefs about the afterlife and the journey of the soul. They often include hidden chambers and precise measurements that encode mathematical relationships. These similarities are too specific to be easily dismissed as coincidence. The Egyptian pyramids in particular have generated endless debate about how they were built and what they represent. The Great Pyramid of Giza is a mathematical marvel, incorporating the value of pi in its proportions, aligned to true north with extraordinary precision. Built from over 2 million stone blocks weighing an average of 2.5 tons each, with the largest stones weighing over 70 tons, all placed with tolerances that would be impressive even with modern surveying equipment. The interior features passages and chambers cut through solid rock with precision that seems to exceed what copper tools should be able to achieve. The sarcophagus in the king's chamber was carved from a single block of granite and hollowed out with perfectly flat surfaces and right-angle corners, a feat that would be difficult even with modern tools. The conventional explanation is that the pyramids were built by teams of skilled workers using copper tools and wooden implements, moving the stones with ropes and sledges and ramps, spending decades on the construction. This is certainly possible, and there is evidence that the pyramids were indeed built by Egyptian workers during the Old Kingdom period. But the precision and sophistication of the construction still seems remarkable, suggesting that the builders had access to advanced knowledge of mathematics and astronomy and engineering that we do not typically associate with Bronze Age civilizations. Some researchers have suggested that the Egyptian pyramids might incorporate knowledge from an earlier time, that they might be based on designs or techniques that were passed down from a more ancient source. This would explain why the largest and most precisely built pyramids, those at Giza, date from relatively early in Egyptian history, with later pyramids being smaller and less precisely constructed, as if the Egyptians were working from inherited knowledge that they gradually lost or simplified over time. It would also explain the sudden appearance of pyramid building in Egyptian civilization without an obvious development period. The first major Egyptian pyramid, the Step Pyramid of Djoser, is a sophisticated structure that shows considerable architectural knowledge, yet it appears relatively suddenly in the archaeological record, without the extensive trial and error we would expect if the Egyptians were figuring out pyramid construction from scratch. It is almost as if they started with advanced knowledge and built impressive structures from the beginning, then gradually lost the sophistication of the original techniques as the knowledge faded. This pattern is more consistent with a civilization inheriting knowledge from an earlier source than with a civilization developing that knowledge entirely on their own. If the Egyptians had received knowledge from survivors of a lost coastal civilization, perhaps refugees who arrived in Egypt at the end of the Ice Age bringing with them the architectural and astronomical knowledge of their drowned homeland, then the sudden sophistication of early Egyptian pyramid construction would make more sense. The astronomical knowledge demonstrated by ancient cultures is another piece of the puzzle that hints at a forgotten prehistory. Cultures around the world built structures that were precisely aligned to the movements of the sun and moon and stars, demonstrating an understanding of astronomy that required careful observation and mathematical calculation. The pyramids of Giza are aligned to true north with an accuracy better than 1/15th of a degree, an achievement that would be impressive even with modern surveying equipment, and requires sophisticated understanding of how to determine true north through astronomical observation. The layout of the three main pyramids appears to match the positions of the three stars in Orion's belt, a correlation that some researchers believe is too precise to be coincidental. Other structures at Giza are aligned to other stars and constellations, creating a complex astronomical map in stone. Similar alignments appear at ancient sites around the world. Stonehenge is aligned to the summer and winter solstices. The temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia are aligned to the spring equinox. The pyramids of the Maya are aligned to the movements of Venus. The ancient city of Teotihuacan in Mexico is laid out in alignment with the setting of the Pleiades constellation. These are not simple or obvious alignments that anyone could notice by accident. They require years of careful observation to track the movements of celestial bodies, mathematical calculations to predict where the sun or stars will rise and set at different times of the year, and precise surveying to align structures to these astronomical phenomena. The question is why ancient peoples invested so much effort into astronomical observation and alignment. The conventional explanation is that astronomy was important for religious reasons, that ancient cultures saw the movements of the heavens as representing the actions of gods, and wanted to build their temples in harmony with these divine patterns. This is undoubtedly part of the answer, but it does not fully explain the level of precision and sophistication we observe. Creating alignments accurate to fractions of a degree requires far more effort than would be needed for simple religious symbolism. The Mayans calculated the length of the solar year to within seconds of the modern value. The ancient Hindus described cosmic cycles lasting millions of years. The Babylonians predicted eclipses using complex mathematical cycles. This level of astronomical knowledge seems to exceed what would be necessary for purely religious purposes and suggests that ancient peoples valued accurate astronomical information for its own sake, as if they were part of a scientific tradition that placed importance on understanding the heavens. If such a tradition had been established by an earlier civilization, one that had spent generations observing the sky and developing mathematical tools to predict celestial events, then later cultures might have inherited this knowledge and maintained it, even if they no longer fully understood where it came from or why it was important. The precession of the equinoxes is a phenomenon that takes thousands of years to observe and requires sophisticated understanding to recognize and measure. Because Earth wobbles slightly on its axis, the position where the sun rises on the spring equinox slowly moves against the background stars, taking about 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. This subtle effect is not something you would notice in a single lifetime, or even in many lifetimes. You would need to maintain astronomical records consistently for thousands of years to detect the pattern. Yet ancient cultures seem to have known about precession. The ancient Egyptians may have encoded knowledge of precession in the design of the pyramids and in their mythology about the ages of the world. The ancient Greeks knew about precession, with the astronomer Hipparchus calculating its rate with impressive accuracy. The Mayans incorporated the precessional cycle into their calendar systems. The ancient Hindu texts describe the yugas, great ages that correspond to precessional periods. How did these ancient cultures know about a phenomenon that takes thousands of years to observe? The most logical explanation is that they inherited this knowledge from a much older source, a civilization that had been observing the heavens continuously for many generations, long enough to detect the slow drift of the equinoxes and calculate the length of the precessional cycle. This knowledge was then passed down through traditions and texts and astronomical practices preserved even as the original civilization that discovered it was lost to history. When we search for evidence of lost civilizations, we face a fundamental problem. The written record only goes back so far. Writing was independently invented in only a few places around the world, and the oldest examples we have date back only about 5,000 years. The Sumerian cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia are among the earliest written documents, dating to around 3200 BCE. Egyptian hieroglyphs appear around the same time. The Indus Valley script dates to roughly 2600 BCE. Chinese writing begins around 1200 BCE. The Mayan script dates to around 300 BCE, though it may have earlier roots. Everything before these dates is prehistory, a time we can only understand through archaeology and oral traditions, without the benefit of written accounts telling us what people thought and knew and experienced. This means that if a civilization existed 10,000 or 15,000 years ago, before writing was invented, they would have left no written record for us to find, no text explaining who they were or what they accomplished. Everything we might know about them would have to come from physical artifacts and structures that survived, or from oral traditions that preserved memories of them through countless generations. However, the earliest written texts we do have sometimes contain hints of much older knowledge. The Sumerian King List, one of the oldest historical documents in existence, begins with a section describing kings who ruled before a great flood, reigning for impossibly long periods measured in thousands of years. After the flood, the text says, kingship was lowered again from heaven, and a new line of kings began ruling for more plausible lengths of time. Scholars interpret the pre-flood section as mythology, but it is interesting that the Sumerians themselves seem to have believed they were recording actual history, maintaining a continuous record that extended back before the flood that destroyed the earlier world. Egyptian texts similarly refer to a time before the pharaohs when gods ruled Egypt, followed by a transitional period of demigods, before mortal kings took over. The Mayans had creation myths describing previous worlds that were destroyed before the current world was established. The Hindu texts speak of previous cycles of civilization rising and falling over vast periods of time. These ancient traditions consistently describe our current civilization as not the first, but rather the latest in a series, with earlier civilizations having been destroyed by various catastrophes. While we should not take these accounts literally, they may preserve a distant memory of actual events, transformed through countless retellings into mythological narratives, but retaining the core idea that human civilization is older and has experienced more setbacks than the historical record reveals. Some ancient texts contain information that seems too advanced for the time when they were written, suggesting they might be copies of earlier sources. The Antikythera mechanism discovered in ancient Greek shipwreck is a mechanical computer from around 100 BCE that could calculate the positions of the sun and moon and planets, predict eclipses, and track the timing of the Olympic Games. It is a device of extraordinary complexity, with dozens of precisely cut bronze gears working together to perform astronomical calculations. Nothing else like it appears in the archaeological record for over 1,000 years. The mechanism shows that ancient Greeks possessed sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and mathematics and mechanical engineering that we did not suspect they had, and it raises the question of what other knowledge they might have possessed that left no trace. The Library of Alexandria in ancient Egypt was said to contain hundreds of thousands of scrolls preserving knowledge from across the ancient world. When the library was destroyed, most of its contents were lost forever, and we can only guess what information it contained. Some ancient writers mention texts and knowledge that no longer survive, hints of lost books and traditions that vanished when the civilizations that maintained them collapsed. How much knowledge from the ancient world has been lost? How many times has human civilization reached a level of sophistication only to collapse, forcing survivors to start over, rebuilding slowly from scattered fragments of what came before? Modern genetic research has added a new dimension to our understanding of prehistory by allowing scientists to track the movements and mixing of ancient populations through their DNA. When researchers analyze the genomes of people from different parts of the world, they can trace lineages back through time, identifying when different populations split apart or came back together, revealing patterns of migration and contact that were previously invisible. This research has confirmed many things that archaeologists suspected, but has also revealed surprises. One of the most significant findings is that there was much more mixing and movement of ancient populations than we previously thought. People were not isolated in separate regions but travelled widely, making contact with distant populations and exchanging genes, and presumably also knowledge and culture. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower and the climate was different, the patterns of human migration and interaction were very different from what we see today, with populations moving across land bridges and coastal routes that no longer exist. Genetic research has revealed that virtually all modern humans outside of Africa descend from a relatively small population that left Africa approximately 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. This population spread across the world remarkably quickly, reaching Australia by about 50,000 years ago, Europe by about 40,000 years ago, and the Americas by at least 15,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier. The speed of this expansion is impressive and suggests that ancient humans were more mobile and adventurous than we sometimes imagine. They were capable of crossing large stretches of ocean to reach new lands, adapting to a wide range of environments from tropical jungles to Arctic tundra, developing different survival strategies and technologies appropriate to each region. By the time the Ice Age ended and sea levels began to rise, humans had already settled in most of the places they could reach, establishing populations on every continent and many islands. When the seas rose and drowned the coastal areas where many of these people lived, the survivors did not simply disappear, but moved inland, mixing with existing populations and creating the genetic patterns we see in modern peoples. One intriguing genetic finding is that there seem to have been several episodes of population mixing that are difficult to explain through simple gradual contact. There are genetic signatures suggesting that people from very distant regions came together at certain points in prehistory, mixing in ways that imply significant movements of populations or contact between groups that we would not expect to have interacted. Some researchers have suggested these patterns might reflect the dispersal of populations from flooded coastal areas, with refugees from rising seas travelling to new regions and mixing with the local populations, creating genetic connections between distant areas that would otherwise be surprising. While genetic evidence cannot prove that an advanced lost civilization existed, it does confirm that human populations were moving around more than we often assume, that people from different regions were in contact with one another, and that there were significant demographic events during the period when sea levels were rising rapidly at the end of the Ice Age. Turned 40 years. These findings are consistent with the idea that coastal populations were displaced by flooding and scattered to various locations where they mixed with local peoples and possibly shared their knowledge and culture. To understand what might have happened to a coastal civilization at the end of the Ice Age, we need to understand just how dramatic the climate changes were during this period. The Ice Age did not end gradually and peacefully. It ended in fits and starts, with periods of rapid warming interrupted by sudden cold snaps, with massive floods caused by the collapse of ice dams, with dramatic shifts in rainfall patterns in vegetation and animal populations. The world was transformed over a period of several thousand years, but within that time there were events that would have seemed catastrophic to the people who experienced them. When a massive ice dam collapsed in North America around 13,000 years ago, it released a flood of glacial meltwater that was larger than all the current rivers on Earth combined, raising global sea levels and drastically changing ocean circulation patterns. This event triggered a period of rapid cooling that lasted over 1,000 years. a sudden return to near-glacial conditions that must have been devastating to human populations who had begun adapting to a warmer climate. Then, when warming resumed around 11,000 years ago, it happened even faster than before, with temperatures in some regions rising by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within a few decades, an almost unimaginable rate of change that would have radically altered every aspect of the environment. The rising sea levels that accompanied these temperature changes were not uniform or steady. They came in pulses, periods of relatively slow rise interrupted by dramatic jumps when large sections of ice sheet collapsed and poured meltwater into the oceans. The period from around 14,000 to 7,000 years ago saw sea levels rise by over 300 feet total, drowning millions of square miles of coastal land. Some parts of this rise happened slowly enough that people could gradually retreat to higher ground, but other pulses happened over just a few centuries or even faster, swallowing entire landscapes within a few generations. Imagine living in a coastal city and watching the sea rise noticeably within your lifetime, seeing landmarks disappear beneath the waves, being forced to abandon the ports and harbours and settlements that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Imagine having to move your entire community inland, leaving behind everything you could not carry, knowing that the homes and temples and marketplaces where your ancestors had lived for generations would soon be lost forever beneath the water. This is what happened to coastal peoples around the world at the end of the Ice Age, not once but repeatedly, as each pulse of sea level rise forced them to move again. The psychological and cultural impact of these events would have been profound. When your entire world floods, when the coastlines and islands that defined your geography disappear, when the sacred sites and ancestral lands that connected you to your past are drowned, it is not just a physical catastrophe but a spiritual and cultural one. The survivors would have been traumatized, carrying memories of what was lost, and telling stories about the disaster that destroyed their world. These stories would have been passed down to their children and grandchildren, gradually transforming from historical accounts into mythological narratives, but retaining the essential truth that there was a great flood that changed everything. The flood myths that appear in cultures around the world are not abstract religious allegories, but genuine cultural memories, distorted by time but rooted in the real experience of populations who watched their coastal homelands drown at the end of the Ice Age. Understanding this helps us see these myths in a new light, not as primitive superstition, but as oral history preserving important information about human experience during one of the most traumatic periods in our species' existence. If an advanced coastal civilization did exist during the Ice Age and was destroyed by rising seas, what happened to the survivors? They would not have simply vanished. People are resilient and adaptable. They would have fled the flooding, moving to higher ground, travelling inland, or to areas less affected by the rising waters. In this process, they would have encountered other human populations, groups who had been living in the interior regions and were not directly affected by the coastal floods. The meeting between these coastal refugees and inland populations would have been a critical moment, a time of cultural exchange and conflict, and mixing that would have shaped the development of human civilization in the millennia that followed. The refugees would have brought with them whatever knowledge and skills they possessed, whatever technologies and techniques they had developed in their now drowned homeland. They would have had knowledge of navigation and boat building from their maritime culture. They might have known agricultural techniques if their civilization had developed farming. They would have had social and organizational skills from living in complex coastal communities. All of this knowledge could have been shared with the inland populations they encountered, accelerating the development of civilization in these new areas. The process would not have been uniform across the world. In some regions, the coastal refugees might have been welcomed and integrated peacefully, sharing their knowledge freely and helping the local populations develop new technologies and social structures. In other regions, there might have been conflict and resistance. with existing populations viewing the newcomers as invaders or competitors. In still other areas, the refugees might have arrived in lands that were sparsely populated or even empty, allowing them to establish new settlements and maintain their culture more intact. The diversity of outcomes would have created different trajectories of development in different parts of the world, with some regions advancing quickly by incorporating knowledge from the refugees, while others developed more slowly on their own. Over time, the memory of where this knowledge came from would fade. Later generations would not remember that their agricultural techniques or architectural styles or astronomical knowledge came from refugees fleeing a drowned coastal civilization. They would think of these things as their own inventions, as part of their own cultural tradition that had always existed. Only in myths and legends would hints of the truth remain, stories about visitors from the sea who brought knowledge, tales of ancestors who came from a land that no longer exists, legends of a golden age before the flood when people knew more than they do now. The idea that human civilization might have been influenced by survivors from a lost advanced culture helps explain several puzzling aspects of early historical civilizations. It explains why agriculture appears suddenly in multiple locations at roughly the same time. If refugees carried farming knowledge to different regions, it explains why early civilization shows sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and mathematics and engineering that seems to exceed what we would expect from cultures just beginning to develop complexity. If they inherited some of this knowledge from an earlier source, it explains the remarkable similarities in architecture and symbolism and religious beliefs across ancient cultures that supposedly had no contact with one another. If they were all influenced by the same predecessor culture whose survivors spread across the world, it explains the flood myths and legends of lost civilizations that appear in virtually every ancient culture. If these stories preserve genuine memories of real events that affected human populations globally, none of this proves that such a lost civilization existed, but it provides a framework for understanding evidence that is otherwise difficult to explain, a hypothesis that ties together multiple independent lines of inquiry into a coherent narrative. One of the strongest objections to the idea of an advanced Ice Age civilization is the lack of obvious technological artifacts. When civilizations collapse, they leave behind traces of their technology in the form of tools and machines and structures that can be found by archaeologists. The Romans left behind roads and aqueducts and buildings. The Mayans left behind pyramids and carved stones and pottery. The ancient Egyptians left behind temples and statues and hieroglyphic inscriptions. If an advanced civilization existed during the Ice Age, where are their artifacts? Why have we not found evidence of their tools and buildings and other technologies? This is a valid question that deserves a serious answer. The first part of the answer is that we have not looked in the right places. If this civilization was primarily coastal, as makes sense given the advantages of coastal settlement, then most of their remains would now be underwater, protected from archaeological investigation by hundreds of feet of ocean. We've explored only a tiny fraction of the submerged coastlines that were above water during the Ice Age, and underwater archaeology is difficult and expensive, meaning we have likely missed most of what is there to find. The second part of the answer is that not all technologies leave durable traces. A civilization that built primarily in wood rather than stone would leave almost nothing for us to find thousands of years later, as wood decomposes relatively quickly, especially underwater. A culture that focused on perishable materials like textiles and leather and plant fibers would similarly leave little trace. The third part of the answer is that the time gap matters enormously. We are talking about a civilization that would have existed 10,000 to 15,000 years ago or even longer. Stone structures can survive that long, but most other materials cannot. Metal corrodes, especially in salt water. Pottery breaks and the fragments scatter. Organic materials decompose almost entirely. Even stone structures can be destroyed by natural processes over such long timescales, broken apart by frost and erosion and geological activity. When we find archaeological sites from 10,000 years ago, we usually find only the most durable artifacts, stone tools, sometimes burned, remains of fires, occasionally bones if preservation conditions are exceptional. Everything else has vanished. A sophisticated civilization from that period could have possessed knowledge of textiles and pottery and woodworking and many other crafts, but we would likely find none of these things in the archaeological record, because they simply would not survive. What we would find are their stone structures, if they built any, and perhaps some stone tools. The absence of complex artifacts does not prove that people were primitive, only that the things they made from perishable materials have not survived for us to find. There is also the question of what we mean by advanced. We tend to assume that advanced civilizations must have metal tools and machines and written language, but this assumption is based on our own civilization's development trajectory. A civilization could be sophisticated in different ways. They could have advanced knowledge of astronomy without having metal tools. They could have complex social organization without having writing. They could understand navigation and boat building and agricultural techniques without developing industrial technology. The peoples of the Pacific Islands navigated across thousands of miles of open ocean using only the stars and wave patterns and bird behavior, without any instruments, demonstrating sophisticated knowledge that allowed them to colonize remote islands across the Pacific. This is an impressive achievement that required complex understanding of natural phenomena, yet it left almost no archaeological trace because it was based on knowledge passed down through oral tradition rather than physical technology. A lost Ice Age civilization might have been advanced in similar ways, possessing extensive knowledge of the natural world and sophisticated techniques for living successfully in their environment, without necessarily developing the kinds of durable artifacts that we associate with civilization. When we step back and look at the full picture, certain patterns emerge that are difficult to dismiss. There are too many coincidences, too many similarities across ancient cultures, too many puzzling anomalies in the archaeological record. Consider the mathematical knowledge encoded in ancient structures. The Great Pyramid of Giza incorporates the value of pi in its proportions, with the ratio of its perimeter to its height equaling twice pi. The same pyramid encodes the value phi, the golden ratio, in its angles. The dimensions of the pyramid, when properly measured, relate to the dimensions of the Earth, with the perimeter of the pyramid's base being exactly the same proportion to the pyramid's height as the Earth's circumference is to its radius. These relationships are too precise to be coincidental. They demonstrate that the pyramid's builders understood advanced mathematics and geometry and had accurate knowledge of the Earth's size. But how did they know the Earth's dimensions? Measuring the size of a planet requires observations from multiple distant locations and sophisticated calculations, the kind of thing we usually attribute to much more recent scientific civilizations. Either the ancient Egyptians were far more advanced than we credit them with being, or they inherited knowledge from an even earlier civilization that had already done the work of measuring the Earth. Similar mathematical relationships appear in other ancient structures. The temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia are built according to complex proportions that relate to astronomical cycles and mathematical constants. The layout of the city of Teotihuacan in Mexico is based on a precise mathematical grid oriented to astronomical alignments. The megalithic stones of Karnak in France are arranged in patterns that some researchers believe encode astronomical and mathematical information. The pyramids of China, though less studied than those of Egypt, show similar mathematical precision in their construction. The appearance of these mathematical relationships in structures built by different cultures at different times in different parts of the world suggests a common source of knowledge, as if all these civilizations were drawing from the same well of information, adapting and applying techniques that came from a shared ancestor culture. The alternative explanation that each civilization independently discovered the same mathematical relationships and decided to encode them in their monuments in similar ways seems less plausible given the specificity of the patterns and the precision with which they are implemented. The symbolism used by ancient cultures also shows remarkable similarities that are hard to explain if these cultures developed entirely independently. The pyramid shape itself appears worldwide, always associated with similar religious and cosmological ideas about connecting earth and heaven, about the journey of the soul after death, about sacred geometry and astronomical alignments. The symbol of the serpent appears in cultures across the world, associated with wisdom and transformation, and often with water. The swastika, before it was corrupted by modern political movements, was an ancient symbol appearing in cultures from Europe to Asia to the Americas, always representing similar concepts of cyclical motion and cosmic order. The cross symbol appears in ancient American cultures that supposedly had no contact with Christian Europe. The tree of life motif appears independently in multiple ancient religions, representing similar ideas about cosmic structure and the connection between different realms of existence. These shared symbols and concepts could be explained by universal human psychology, by the idea that humans everywhere tend to develop similar symbolic systems because we all have similar brains. But the specificity of some of these parallels suggests something more than psychological universals. It suggests actual cultural transmission, real connections between ancient peoples who shared knowledge and symbolism that we can still detect in the archaeological and mythological record. The geological evidence provides strong support for the idea that catastrophic flooding occurred at the end of the Ice Age and would have devastated any coastal civilizations that existed. The period from about 15,000 to 7,000 years ago saw dramatic changes in sea level that are well documented in the geological record. Core samples taken from the ocean floor show layers of sediment that correspond to different sea levels and climate conditions. These cores reveal that sea level did not rise smoothly, but rather in fits and starts, with periods of relatively stable conditions punctuated by rapid increases when large sections of ice sheet collapsed. The most dramatic of these pulses, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 14,400 years ago and caused sea level to rise by somewhere between 50 and 80 feet in less than 500 years, possibly much faster. This would have been catastrophic for any coastal populations, drowning entire landscapes in a geological eye blink. The evidence for these rapid sea level rises is not controversial among geologists. The debate is not about whether it happened, but about the exact timing and magnitude of the pulses. What remains controversial is whether there were human populations advanced enough at that time to be significantly impacted, and whether those populations left any trace for us to find. The conventional view is that humans during this period were still hunter-gatherers living in small mobile groups, so while rising seas would have forced them to move, it would not have destroyed any significant civilization because no such civilization existed. The alternative view is that we have systematically underestimated the sophistication of Ice Age peoples because we have not looked in the right places, specifically in the coastal areas that are now underwater. The geological evidence confirms that these areas existed, that they would have been prime real estate for human settlement, and that they were catastrophically flooded at the end of the Ice Age. The question is whether anyone built anything significant there before the floods came. Some geological formations that were once dismissed as natural are being reconsidered in light of new evidence and techniques. The Yonaguni structures off Japan, the Gulf of Cambay formations off India, the Bimini Road off the Bahamas, and various other underwater anomalies have all been investigated to determine whether they might be human-made. In each case, there are features that seem unnaturally regular, too geometric and organized to be entirely the work of erosion and natural geological processes. In each case, there are also features that could be explained naturally, making it difficult to reach a definitive conclusion. What these controversial sites demonstrate is how hard it is to do underwater archaeology properly. You cannot simply look at formations through murky water and decide whether they are natural or artificial. You need careful excavation, detailed measurements, analysis of tool marks and construction techniques, all of which are extremely difficult to do underwater at depths of 50 to 100 feet or more. Until we develop better techniques and dedicate more resources to exploring these submerged landscapes, the question of whether they contain evidence of lost civilizations will remain unresolved, with believers and skeptics both able to point to aspects of the evidence that support their position. The persistence of flood myths and legends of lost civilizations across so many cultures is perhaps the most compelling evidence that something real lies behind these stories. It is easy to dismiss individual myths as fantasy or moral tales, but when you find the same essential narrative appearing independently in cultures around the world, you have to consider that there might be a common experience underlying these stories. The flood narrative appears in Mesopotamian texts, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the biblical story of Noah, in Greek myths about Deucalion, in Hindu texts about Manu, in Chinese legends, in indigenous American stories, in Pacific Island traditions, in Aboriginal Australian accounts, and in many other cultural contexts. The details vary, but the core story is remarkably consistent. There was a great flood. It destroyed the world that existed before. A few people survived by building boats or escaping to high ground. They became the ancestors of the current humanity. This narrative pattern is too widespread and too consistent to be purely coincidental. The specific details in some flood myths are particularly interesting because they seem to preserve accurate geographical information about places that have been underwater for thousands of years. Aboriginal Australian stories describe coastal landscapes and islands that archaeological and geological research has confirmed existed during lower sea levels but have been submerged for over 7,000 years. The fact that these stories accurately describe real geographical features that have been underwater for 70 centuries proves that oral traditions can maintain accurate information over immense timespans. If the Aboriginal Australians preserved accurate geographical memories for 7,000 years, then it is entirely plausible that other cultures preserved memories of events and places from equally long ago. The flood myths found around the world might be genuine historical memories from the end of the Ice Age, passed down through hundreds of generations and transformed into mythological narratives, but retaining a core of truth about real events that affected human populations globally. The legends of lost advanced civilizations are similarly widespread and consistent. Plato's Atlantis is the most famous, but similar stories appear in many traditions. The Sumerians told of a golden age before the flood, when the gods taught humans knowledge and civilization flourished. The Egyptians spoke of a time when their land was ruled by gods who possessed great wisdom. The Hindu texts describe previous cycles of civilization that rose to great heights before being destroyed and having to begin again. The Mayans had legends of previous worlds that were destroyed before the current creation. These stories all share the idea that human civilization is not a simple linear progression, but rather a cycle of rise and fall, with earlier civilizations achieving wisdom and sophistication before being destroyed by catastrophe. While we should not take these myths literally, they may preserve a cultural memory of actual events, a recognition that the current historical civilizations are not the first but rather built on the ruins of what came before. This cyclical view of history, though unfashionable in modern Western thought, may actually be more accurate than our assumption of steady linear progress from primitive beginnings to modern sophistication. One of the most persistent mysteries in archaeology is the question of how much contact existed between ancient civilizations that were supposedly isolated from one another. The conventional view is that civilizations in the Americas developed completely independently from those in Europe, Africa, and Asia, with no significant contact until Columbus arrived in 1492. Similarly, civilizations in different parts of Asia are usually thought to have developed separately, with only occasional trade and cultural exchange. But growing evidence suggests that ancient peoples traveled much more widely than this conventional picture allows. There are plants and animals that appear in places they should not be able to reach without human transport. There are artifacts found in unexpected locations, suggesting trade networks that spanned greater distances than we thought possible. There are architectural and cultural similarities between distant civilizations that seem too specific to be independent invention. All of this points to a world where ancient peoples were more connected, more mobile, and more adventurous than traditional archaeology has acknowledged. The evidence for possible transoceanic contact in prehistory includes several intriguing finds. Cocaine and tobacco, which are native to the Americas, have been found in Egyptian mummies, suggesting either that ancient Egyptians somehow acquired these American plants, or that the samples are contaminated, though repeated testing has confirmed their presence. Roman-era artifacts have been found in Brazil, including pottery and coins, though skeptics argue these could be hoaxes or later introductions. In the Pacific, the Polynesians accomplished remarkable feats of navigation, settling islands separated by thousands of miles of open ocean, demonstrating that ancient peoples were capable of long-distance voyaging that we once thought impossible. The sweet potato, a plant native to South America, was being cultivated in Polynesia long before any known European contact, proving that somehow this plant crossed thousands of miles of ocean, whether by deliberate human transport or by some other means. Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki expedition proved that ancient boats could make transoceanic crossings, even if his specific theories about migration patterns turned out to be wrong. All of this evidence suggests that ancient peoples were seafaring adventurers who explored widely and established contacts across distances that seem impressive even by modern standards. If ancient peoples were capable of such long-distance travel and contact, then the idea of a maritime civilization during the Ice Age becomes even more plausible. A culture that focused on seafaring and coastal settlement would naturally develop advanced navigation techniques and boat-building skills. They would establish trade networks connecting different coastal regions. They would be positioned to spread knowledge and technology across vast distances, creating cultural connections between areas that might otherwise have remained isolated. When rising seas destroyed their coastal homeland, survivors with boats and navigation knowledge could have traveled to distant shores, arriving in various parts of the world and influencing the local populations they encountered. This would explain the similarities we observe between ancient civilizations, the shared symbolism and astronomical knowledge and architectural techniques that appear in cultures supposedly too distant to have been in contact. It would explain the sudden advancement we see in multiple regions at roughly the same time period. It would explain the legends found in many cultures about teachers who came from the sea bringing knowledge and wisdom, stories that might preserve memories of actual historical contacts with seafaring refugees from a drowned civilization. Modern scientific understanding of how quickly civilizations can be destroyed gives us perspective on what might have happened at the end of the Ice Age. We know from historical examples that sophisticated civilizations can collapse with shocking speed, sometimes within a single generation, leaving only ruins and refugees behind. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE saw multiple advanced civilizations around the Mediterranean suddenly fall into chaos, with cities abandoned, writing systems lost, and populations declining dramatically. The causes are still debated, but the speed of the collapse is undeniable. The Mayan civilization reached great heights of sophistication and then collapsed relatively suddenly, with cities being abandoned and the population dispersing, apparently due to a combination of drought, warfare, and political instability. The Roman Empire, one of the most powerful and enduring civilizations in history, fell apart over the course of just a few centuries, fragmenting into smaller kingdoms and losing much of the knowledge and technology that had been accumulated over centuries. These historical examples show that civilizations are fragile and can be destroyed by natural disasters, climate change, warfare, disease, or some combination of these factors. The catastrophic flooding that occurred at the end of the Ice Age would have been more than capable of destroying a coastal civilization. When sea level rises by 50 feet or more in a few centuries, Entire regions that were once dry land are drowned. Cities and ports that were built near the coast find themselves underwater. The rich agricultural lands of coastal plains are flooded and destroyed. Trade routes that connected different communities are disrupted. The social and economic networks that held the civilization together are torn apart. The survivors are forced to flee, abandoning everything they cannot carry, losing the infrastructure and accumulated resources that made their advanced lifestyle possible. When a civilization collapses this catastrophically, much knowledge can be lost. Specialized crafts that were practiced by only a few experts disappear when those experts die without passing on their skills. Written records are lost when libraries and archives are destroyed. Technologies that depended on specific materials or conditions become impossible to maintain. The survivors might remember that their ancestors knew how to do certain things, but without the resources and infrastructure to support those practices, the knowledge gradually fades away, preserved only in stories that become increasingly distorted over time. This is what might have happened to a coastal civilization at the end of the Ice Age. The rapid rise in sea level would have flooded their major settlements, destroyed their ports and harbours, submerged the coastal lands where they grew their food. The survivors would have fled inland or to higher ground, becoming refugees in lands that might already have been occupied by other populations. In their new circumstances, they could not maintain the same level of complexity they had achieved in their drowned homeland. Many specialized skills and technologies would have been lost simply because they were no longer practical or possible without the infrastructure that had supported them. Over time, the descendants of these refugees would have forgotten how advanced their ancestors were, remembering only that there had once been a great civilization that was destroyed by flooding. The specific details would fade, transformed into myths about lost golden ages and cities that sank beneath the waves. But the knowledge they did manage to preserve, things like agricultural techniques and astronomical understanding and architectural principles, would have been passed on and could have influenced the development of later civilizations in multiple regions where the refugees settled. The hypothesis of a lost Ice Age civilization destroyed by flooding is not accepted by mainstream archaeology, and it is important to understand why. The conventional view is that the evidence simply does not support the existence of such a civilization. Archaeologists point out that we have found no definitive artifacts that can be dated to more than 10,000 years ago, and that show the kind of sophistication we would expect from an advanced civilization. The underwater structures that have been proposed as evidence of lost civilizations are ambiguous and can usually be explained as natural formations. The similarities between ancient cultures can be explained by independent invention and universal human tendencies. Flood myths can be explained as memories of local flooding events, or as psychological narratives that humans naturally create to explain the world. The sudden appearance of agriculture and civilization can be explained by climate change creating favorable conditions, and by the natural tendency of human knowledge to develop exponentially once certain thresholds are crossed. All of these explanations are reasonable and are supported by decades of archaeological research. The burden of proof lies with those claiming that an advanced lost civilization existed, and most archaeologists feel that burden has not been met. However, the alternative perspective points out several problems with the conventional view. First, the archaeological record is incomplete, especially for periods more than 10,000 years ago, and especially for coastal regions that are now underwater. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly when we have not looked in the places where evidence would most likely be found. Second, the conventional timeline of civilization requires us to accept a remarkable series of coincidences. With agriculture appearing independently in multiple locations at almost the same time, with similar architectural and astronomical knowledge appearing in widely separated cultures, with flood myths and legends of lost civilizations appearing in virtually every ancient tradition. While each individual coincidence can be explained, The cumulative weight of all these anomalies suggests that something is missing from our understanding of prehistory. Third, recent archaeological discoveries keep pushing back the date when humans were capable of sophisticated organization and construction, with sites like Göbekli Tepe showing that people were building massive stone complexes thousands of years earlier than was previously thought possible. Each time such a discovery is made, it forces us to revise our assumptions about what ancient peoples were capable of. How many more such revisions will be necessary before we acknowledge that we have fundamentally underestimated the sophistication of Ice Age cultures? The debate between conventional and alternative views of prehistory is not likely to be resolved soon, but it is a healthy debate that pushes both sides to sharpen their arguments and search for better evidence. The mainstream archaeologists are right to demand high standards of proof before accepting revolutionary claims that overturn established understanding. The alternative researchers are right to point out that conventional archaeology has blind spots and has been wrong before about the capabilities of ancient peoples. The truth probably lies somewhere between the extremes. It seems unlikely that there was a lost civilization as advanced as the industrial civilizations of the last few centuries, but it seems equally unlikely that all humans before 6,000 years ago were uniformly primitive hunter-gatherers with no capacity for complex organization or sophisticated knowledge. The real question is not whether lost civilizations existed, but rather how sophisticated they might have been, what kind of knowledge they might have possessed, and how much influence they might have had on the later civilizations that we do know about. These are questions that can only be answered through more research, more exploration, and a willingness to consider evidence wherever it might lead, rather than assuming we already know the full story. The ocean holds the answers to many of our questions about lost civilizations, but it guards those answers jealously. The continental shelves that were dry land during the Ice Age are now covered by water ranging from a few dozen feet to over 400 feet deep, depending on the location and the local topography. These drowned landscapes represent millions of square miles of territory that would have been prime real estate for human settlement, offering access to both marine resources and inland areas, providing moderate climates and abundant resources. If we could somehow drain the oceans and expose these submerged lands, we would likely find extensive evidence of human occupation from the Ice Age. The remains of settlements and campsites and hunting grounds that were in use for thousands of years before the waters claimed them. Some of these sites might be simple evidence of hunter-gatherer populations, but others might reveal more complex occupations, possibly even the remains of cities and monuments that would force us to completely revise our understanding of prehistory. The technology to explore these underwater landscapes has improved dramatically in recent years. Multi-beam sonar can map the ocean floor with resolution that was impossible just a few decades ago, revealing details of underwater topography that allow researchers to identify areas where human settlements might have existed. Remote-operated vehicles can explore sites too deep for human divers, equipped with cameras and sensors that can document underwater features in detail. Submarine technology has advanced to the point where researchers can spend extended periods underwater, allowing for more thorough investigation of potential archaeological sites. Underwater excavation techniques have been refined, making it possible to carefully document and recover artifacts from underwater sites without destroying the context that makes them valuable. All of these advances mean that underwater archaeology is becoming more feasible and more productive, giving us new tools to search for evidence of lost civilizations in the places where that evidence is most likely to be found. Despite these advances, exploring the drowned continental shelves remains extremely challenging and expensive. The areas to be searched are vast, making comprehensive surveys prohibitively costly. Even when promising features are identified, confirming whether they are natural or artificial requires close inspection and often excavation, which is difficult underwater. Many of the most interesting areas are in international waters or in locations where political or practical considerations make research difficult. Funding for underwater archaeology is limited, with most resources going to more conventional archaeological projects on land. As a result, only a tiny fraction of the submerged Ice Age landscapes have been explored, and most of what has been explored has received only cursory examination. The promising sites that have been identified and that show anomalous features that might be evidence of human construction remain controversial because they have not been studied thoroughly enough to reach definitive conclusions. This situation is frustrating for researchers who believe there is important evidence waiting to be found underwater, but it is also understandable given the practical and financial challenges involved. The reality is that fully exploring the underwater archaeological potential of the drowned continental shelves would require a massive, sustained international effort on a scale that has not yet been attempted. Some researchers have suggested that the catastrophic events at the end of the Ice Age might have been triggered or accelerated by cosmic impacts, comets or asteroids striking the Earth and causing rapid climate change, and possibly also directly destroying civilizations through the immediate effects of the impacts. This idea, known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, proposes that around 12,800 years ago, a comet or multiple comet fragments struck the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere, triggering massive wildfires generating huge amounts of dust that blocked sunlight, causing a sudden return to cold conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. The evidence for this includes a layer of sediment found at numerous sites around the world that dates to the right time period, and that contains unusual materials like nanodiamonds and magnetic spherules, and high levels of platinum and iridium, all of which can be created by cosmic impacts or airbursts. There is also evidence of a massive extinction of large mammals in North America around this time, with dozens of species disappearing relatively suddenly, which could have been caused by the environmental disruption following an impact. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is controversial, with many scientists arguing that the evidence can be explained in other ways, and that the proposed impacts would have left more obvious traces like impact craters, which have not been found. However, if the impacts were airbursts rather than actual collisions with the ground, they might not have left craters, and if some fragments landed in the ocean or in areas now covered by ice, the craters would not be easily detectable. The hypothesis continues to generate research and debate, with new evidence being presented on both sides. For our purposes, what is interesting is that if cosmic impacts did occur at the end of the Ice Age, they could have contributed to the destruction of any advanced civilizations that existed at the time. An airburst over a coastal city would have been instantly catastrophic, destroying the city and killing the population. Impacts in the ocean would have generated massive tsunamis that would have devastated coastal areas. The environmental effects of multiple impacts, including wildfires and climate disruption, would have made survival difficult even for populations not directly hit. If a coastal civilization was already struggling to cope with rising sea levels and climate change, cosmic impacts could have delivered the final blow, fragmenting what remained of their society and scattering the survivors. The idea of catastrophic cosmic impacts affecting human civilizations connects to another mystery of prehistory: the question of why large animals went extinct at the end of the Ice Age. North America lost dozens of species of megafauna, including mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and many others. Similar extinctions occurred on other continents. The conventional explanation is that a combination of climate change and human hunting pressure caused these extinctions, but the speed and scale of the die-off suggests something more catastrophic might have been involved. If cosmic impacts occurred, they could explain both the rapid extinction of animals and the disruption of human societies. The survivors, whether human or animal, would have faced a changed world, one where the rules of survival were different, and where much of what had worked before no longer applied. For humans, this would have meant abandoning coastal settlements that were flooded or destroyed, moving inland and adapting to new environments, competing with other populations for resources, and gradually losing the sophisticated knowledge and technologies that had been developed in more stable times. The survivors would have remembered that something terrible happened, that the world was destroyed by fire or flood or both, but the specific details would have faded, leaving only mythological accounts of catastrophic events that ended the world that came before. As we drift deeper into contemplation of these possibilities, the boundary between what we know and what we imagine begins to blur, not through lack of rigor, but through the recognition that history is built from fragments, from pieces of evidence that we assemble into narratives that seem plausible but can never be completely certain. The ancient peoples who might have witnessed the drowning of their world left traces that are so subtle, so scattered, so hidden beneath the waves that we can only glimpse them in passing, like shadows seen from the corner of the eye. The monuments they might have built are now covered by sediment and water, their bones dissolved in the salty depths, their stories transformed through thousands of retellings until they became unrecognizable as history. Yet something remains, a whisper that carries across the millennia, a sense that our story is longer and more complex than the textbooks tell us, that before the civilizations we know about there were others, and before those others there was still more stretching back into a past that we can barely imagine. This feeling of something lost, something forgotten, something that calls to us from the depths, is part of what drives both archaeological research and human imagination. We are drawn to mysteries because they remind us that the world is larger and stranger than our daily experience suggests. We want to believe that our ancestors were capable of great things, that they possessed wisdom and knowledge that has been lost, that they lived through experiences so profound that the memory of them still echoes in our collective consciousness. Whether or not a specific advanced civilization existed during the Ice Age and was destroyed by rising seas, the broader truth is undeniable. Human history is full of lost knowledge, forgotten peoples, civilizations that rose and fell leaving only traces behind. Every archaeological discovery reminds us how much we do not know, how much remains hidden in the ground or beneath the waters. The great libraries of the ancient world were destroyed, taking with them countless texts and the knowledge they contained. The oral traditions of many cultures were disrupted by colonization and cultural destruction, severing connections to the past. Languages have died, taking with them unique ways of understanding and describing the world. Entire civilizations have been forgotten, their names lost, their achievements unknown except for the ruins they left behind. In this context, the question of whether a specific lost civilization sank beneath the waves at the end of the Ice Age becomes less important than the larger recognition that history is a tapestry with many threads missing, a puzzle with significant pieces lost. Our understanding of the past is always provisional, always subject to revision as new evidence emerges. The responsible approach is to remain open to new possibilities while demanding rigorous evidence, to question established narratives while acknowledging their strengths, to imagine what might have been while grounding our speculations in what we can demonstrate. The ocean keeps its secrets, but gradually, patiently, with improved technology and sustained effort, we are learning to read the stories written in the submerged landscapes and the layers of sediment on the ocean floor. Each discovery, whether it supports or challenges the hypothesis of a lost civilization, adds to our knowledge and helps us build a more complete picture of human prehistory. The journey of discovery continues, and the ocean still has much to teach us. If we accept the possibility that survivors from a drowned coastal civilization might have influenced the development of later cultures, we can look at early historical civilizations with new eyes, searching for signs of inherited knowledge that might point back to an earlier source. The sudden sophistication of the earliest known civilizations becomes more understandable if they were building on a foundation that already existed rather than starting from scratch. The Sumerians appear in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, with a complete package of civilizational features including writing, mathematics, astronomy, complex architecture, sophisticated irrigation systems, and elaborate religious practices. There is some evidence of gradual development in earlier periods, but the speed with which Sumerian civilization reached its mature form is still remarkable. Similarly, Egyptian civilization appears suddenly and impressively, with the pyramids being built relatively early in Egyptian history using techniques that later Egyptians seemed unable to fully replicate. The Indus Valley civilization shows evidence of sophisticated urban planning from its earliest known phases, with cities laid out on regular grids and equipped with advanced drainage systems that suggest considerable prior knowledge of engineering principles. These patterns suggest that the early historical civilizations might have been recovering or rediscovering knowledge that had been lost, rather than inventing everything new. If refugees from a drowned coastal civilization had settled in various regions and passed on what knowledge they could preserve, we might expect to see exactly what we do see. Civilizations appearing with surprising sophistication, possessing knowledge that seems advanced for their time, sharing common features despite being geographically separated. The survivors would not have been able to simply recreate their lost civilization in a new location. They would have been refugees, arriving with limited resources, needing to adapt to new environments and integrate with existing populations. Much of their specialized knowledge would have been lost because it depended on infrastructure and resources that no longer existed, but some knowledge would have survived: practical skills and astronomical understanding and mathematical principles that could be remembered and taught even without the original context. This knowledge would have given the communities that received it a significant advantage, allowing them to develop more quickly than they otherwise would have, creating the impression of sudden sophisticated civilizations emerging without adequate preparation time. The role of Egypt in this scenario is particularly interesting because Egyptian civilization itself preserved traditions claiming that their knowledge came from earlier times. The Egyptian priests told Plato's ancestor Solon that Egyptian records extended back thousands of years before Greek civilization existed, and that the Greeks had forgotten their own earlier history because catastrophic floods had destroyed their records. The priests claimed that Egypt had been spared some of these catastrophes because the Nile's flooding was predictable and manageable, allowing Egyptian civilization to maintain continuity while others were destroyed and had to start over. Whether or not we accept this claim literally, it suggests that the Egyptians themselves believed they were heirs to a much longer tradition of knowledge, that what they knew had been passed down from earlier sources rather than invented by them. The gods who were said to have ruled Egypt before the pharaohs might be mythologized memories of teachers from a lost civilization, visitors who brought knowledge and established the foundations of Egyptian culture before disappearing back into legend. The fact that Egyptian civilization maintained such consistency over thousands of years, preserving traditions and knowledge with remarkable fidelity, suggests they saw themselves as guardians of something precious that had been entrusted to them, keepers of wisdom that must not be allowed to die. Ancient monuments can be read as attempts to preserve knowledge in forms that would survive across vast time spans, encoding information in stone that would outlast any written record or oral tradition. The pyramids and temples and stone circles of the ancient world were not merely religious structures or tombs, but repositories of knowledge designed to communicate important information to future generations, even if the civilization that built them collapsed. The astronomical alignments of these structures ensure that they continue to mark significant celestial events year after year, century after century, serving as permanent observatories that demonstrate the builder's understanding of the heavens. The mathematical relationships encoded in their proportions preserve geometric and mathematical principles in forms that can be measured and decoded by anyone with sufficient knowledge, regardless of what language they speak or what culture they belong to. The massive scale and durable construction ensure that these structures will survive when everything else from their civilization has crumbled to dust, standing as testaments that an advanced culture once existed even when all other evidence has vanished. This suggests an interesting possibility. If an Ice Age civilization knew they were facing catastrophic flooding, they might have attempted to preserve their most important knowledge in forms that would survive the disaster. They could not save their cities or their infrastructure, but they might have tried to save their knowledge by encoding it in monuments built on high ground that would not be submerged, or by teaching it to people in inland areas who would survive the floods, or by creating portable records that refugees could carry with them to new lands. The astronomical knowledge found in later civilizations could be one form of preserved information, practical knowledge about the movements of celestial bodies that would remain valid forever and could be used for navigation and timekeeping by future generations. The mathematical principles encoded in ancient structures could be another form, demonstrating geometric relationships and proportions that would be useful for anyone attempting to build sophisticated structures. The agricultural knowledge that appears in multiple locations at the end of the Ice Age could represent practical information about plant and animal domestication that was deliberately taught by refugees who wanted to help the people they encountered establish stable food supplies. If we view ancient monuments as acts of preservation, as desperate attempts to save knowledge from being lost in catastrophe, they take on a poignancy that makes them even more powerful. The people who built them knew that their world was ending, that the seas were rising, that the civilization could not survive, that they refused to let their knowledge die with them. They built structures that would last, encoded information in forms that could be decoded, taught what they knew to anyone who would listen, hoping that someday, in a distant future they would never see, their descendants would rediscover what had been lost and understand that they were not the first to climb towards civilization, not the first to study the stars and build monuments and seek understanding. The monuments stand as messages across time, whispers from ancestors we have forgotten, reminders that human knowledge is precious and fragile, that civilizations can fall and wisdom can be lost, that we should treasure what we have learned and preserve it for those who come after, because we cannot know when the next catastrophe will come and sweep away everything we have built. The ancient concept of cyclical time, of history repeating in great cycles of rise and fall, stands in stark contrast to the modern Western view of linear progress. We tend to see history as a story of steady advancement from primitive beginnings to modern sophistication, with each generation building on the achievements of those who came before, moving ever upward toward greater knowledge and capability. But many ancient cultures saw time differently, as a wheel that turns through recurring phases, with ages of enlightenment followed by ages of darkness, with civilizations rising to great heights before falling and having to start over. The Hindu concept of yugas describes vast cycles lasting millions of years, with humanity moving through ages of different qualities, from golden ages of wisdom and long life to dark ages of ignorance and suffering, before the cycle begins again. The Mayan calendar marks great cycles of creation and destruction. The ancient Greeks spoke of ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each less glorious than the last until the cycle resets. These cyclical views of history might seem like fatalistic mythology, but they could also reflect a deep cultural memory of actual events, a recognition based on experience that civilizations do fall, that knowledge can be lost, that what seems permanent and secure can be swept away by forces beyond human control. The geological and archaeological evidence we have been discussing supports this cyclical view more than it does the story of steady linear progress. Human history is not a smooth upward climb, but rather a series of rises and falls, with civilizations achieving sophistication and then collapsing, with knowledge being gained and then lost, with populations advancing and then being thrown back by catastrophes. The end of the Ice Age represents one such turning point, a time of massive environmental change that would have disrupted whatever human societies existed, forcing them to adapt or die, destroying some communities entirely while allowing others to survive and eventually rebuild. The Bronze Age collapse represents another such crisis, a mysterious catastrophe that caused multiple civilizations around the Mediterranean to fall simultaneously, leading to a dark age that lasted centuries before new civilizations emerged. The fall of Rome represents another cycle, with the sophisticated knowledge and technology of the Roman world being largely lost in Western Europe, requiring centuries of redevelopment before European civilization reached the same level again. These examples from relatively recent history, backed by extensive documentation and archaeological evidence, demonstrate that civilizational collapse is real and can result in significant loss of knowledge. If this has happened repeatedly in the last few thousand years, how many times might it have happened in the previous 10,000 or 20,000 years? In periods where we have much less evidence to work with, the cyclical view has practical implications for how we think about our own civilization and its relationship to the past. If we recognize that civilizations can fall and that knowledge can be lost, we might take more seriously the importance of preserving what we know and making it accessible to future generations. We might look to the past not just for historical curiosity, but for practical wisdom, for lessons about what works and what does not, for warnings about the kinds of mistakes that lead to collapse. The ancient civilizations that survived and passed on their knowledge might have something to teach us about resilience and adaptation. The lost civilizations that vanished beneath the waves or collapsed into dust might offer cautionary tales about the consequences of environmental degradation or social dysfunction or failure to adapt to changing conditions. Instead of dismissing ancient knowledge as primitive superstition, we might ask whether some of it represents hard-won understanding preserved through catastrophes that destroyed everything else. Instead of assuming we are the pinnacle of human achievement, we might consider that we are simply the current phase in a long cycle, benefiting from knowledge passed down from those who came before, responsible for passing it on to those who come after, aware that our own civilization is as mortal as all the others that have risen and fallen before us. The question of lost civilizations is not merely an academic exercise or a source of entertainment for mystery enthusiasts. It connects directly to pressing questions about our current situation and our future. We live in a time of rapid environmental change, with sea levels rising, climate shifting, species going extinct, and human activity transforming the planet at a scale and speed that has few precedents in the geological record. If past civilizations were destroyed or severely disrupted by environmental catastrophes, their experience might offer insights relevant to our own challenges. If rising seas at the end of the Ice Age forced the abandonment of coastal areas and the collapse of civilizations built in those areas, what does that tell us about the vulnerability of our own coastal cities to future sea level rise? If rapid climate change during the Younger Dryas caused widespread disruption and possibly contributed to civilizational collapse, what might we expect from the rapid climate change we are currently experiencing? If cosmic impacts have occurred in the past and caused catastrophic damage to human societies, how seriously should we take the risk of future impacts, and what should we be doing to detect and potentially deflect dangerous asteroids? The archaeological and geological evidence we have discussed demonstrates that catastrophic events are not merely theoretical possibilities, but real occurrences that have happened repeatedly throughout human history. Sea levels have risen hundreds of feet, drowning vast areas of coastline. Climate has shifted dramatically and quickly, forcing populations to adapt or move or die. Mass extinctions have occurred, wiping out entire ecosystems within relatively brief periods. Civilizations have collapsed suddenly, losing much of their accumulated knowledge and having to rebuild from fragments. These are not ancient events that can never happen again, but rather examples of the kinds of disasters that Earth's climate system and cosmic environment can produce. Events that could happen again in the future and that we should be prepared for. The fact that we have built a complex, interconnected global civilization dependent on stable environmental conditions and vulnerable to disruption from natural disasters or climate change should concern us. when we look at how easily previous civilizations were destroyed by similar challenges. At the same time, the story of human resilience and recovery offers hope. Despite catastrophic events that destroyed civilizations and drowned coastal lands and caused mass extinctions, humans survived and eventually rebuilt. The survivors of the Ice Age floods went on to establish new civilizations that achieved even greater sophistication than what was lost. Knowledge that was partially lost was eventually rediscovered or reinvented. Populations that were reduced to small numbers of refugees expanded again and flourished. This demonstrates that while civilizations are fragile and can collapse, humanity as a whole is resilient and capable of recovering from even catastrophic setbacks. The key factors that enabled survival seem to have been adaptability, the ability to learn and change in response to new circumstances, the preservation of critical knowledge even in fragmentary form, and the maintenance of hope and purpose across generations. These are lessons we can apply to our own situation, reminding us that while we should take threats seriously and work to prevent catastrophes where possible, we should also maintain confidence in human capacity to survive and adapt and rebuild even when faced with enormous challenges. As we near the end of this exploration, we must acknowledge that the question of whether an advanced civilization existed during the Ice Age and was destroyed by rising seas remains unresolved. The evidence we have examined is suggestive but not conclusive. The drowned coastlines exist and would have been prime locations for human settlement. The rapid sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age is well documented and would have been catastrophic for coastal populations. The flood myths and legends of lost civilizations appear in cultures around the world, suggesting shared memories of real events. The sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge in multiple early civilizations suggests possible inheritance from an earlier source. The astronomical and mathematical knowledge encoded in ancient structures seems to exceed what we would expect from people supposedly just beginning to develop civilization. The similarities between distant ancient cultures are difficult to explain if they developed entirely independently. All of these facts are intriguing and point toward the possibility that something important happened during the Ice Age that we have not fully recognized or understood. However, the definitive evidence that would prove the existence of an advanced Ice Age civilization has not been found. No undisputed underwater cities have been discovered and thoroughly documented. No artifacts have been found that clearly demonstrate sophisticated technology from more than 10,000 years ago. No written records from such a civilization have been recovered. The underwater structures that have been proposed as possible evidence remain controversial, with skeptics able to offer plausible natural explanations for their features. The similarities between ancient cultures can be explained by independent invention and universal human tendencies without requiring a common predecessor civilization. The rapid development of early historical civilizations can be understood as the result of favorable environmental conditions and cumulative knowledge building, without needing to invoke lost wisdom from an early age. The mainstream archaeological position remains that humans before about 6,000 years ago were primarily hunter-gatherers, who, while certainly intelligent and capable, had not yet developed the social complexity and technological sophistication that we associate with true civilization. The debate will continue, driven forward by new discoveries and new technologies that allow us to explore areas previously inaccessible. Each underwater archaeological expedition has the potential to find evidence that could transform our understanding of prehistory. Each new dating technique and analytical method gives us better tools to interpret ancient artifacts and structures. Each discovery of an unexpectedly old or sophisticated prehistoric site forces us to revise our assumptions about what ancient peoples were capable of. The question of lost civilizations remains open, not because the evidence clearly supports their existence, but because the evidence does not clearly rule them out, and because the gaps in our knowledge remain large enough that significant surprises are still possible. The ocean floor is largely unexplored. The submerged Ice Age coastlines have barely been investigated. Large areas of the world have never been systematically surveyed for archaeological sites. Every year brings new discoveries that remind us how much we still do not know about our past. The mystery continues, calling to those who wonder whether the story we tell ourselves about human history is complete or whether important chapters remain hidden waiting to be discovered. Whether or not a specific advanced lost civilization is ever proven to have existed, the search for such civilization serves important purposes. It pushes us to question assumptions and look beyond conventional narratives. It encourages exploration of areas and topics that might otherwise be neglected. It reminds us that our knowledge is incomplete and that there is always more to learn. It connects us to our ancestors and to the long sweep of human history, helping us understand that we are part of a story that extends far beyond our individual lives or even our current civilization. The question of where we came from and what earlier humans achieved matters because it shapes how we think about ourselves and our potential. If we believe that humans before a few thousand years ago were incapable of sophisticated thought and organization, we might underestimate human potential and assume that our current way of doing things is the only way or the best way. If we recognize that ancient peoples were capable of remarkable achievements, that they possessed knowledge and wisdom that we have lost, we might be more humble about our own accomplishments and more willing to learn from the past. The search for lost civilizations also raises important questions about what we value and what we choose to preserve. Every civilization creates knowledge and art and culture that reflects its unique perspective and experience. When civilizations fall and knowledge is lost, humanity as a whole is impoverished. We lose diverse ways of understanding the world, different solutions to universal problems, unique artistic and philosophical traditions that can never be exactly recreated. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria was a tragedy not just for the ancient world, but for all subsequent generations who might have benefited from the knowledge it contained. The loss of indigenous languages and traditions due to colonization and cultural destruction represents a permanent diminishment of human cultural diversity. If entire civilizations from the Ice Age were lost beneath the waves, taking their knowledge and achievements with them, that too is a tragedy that affects us today because we have lost whatever wisdom and understanding they might have contributed to the cumulative human legacy. This recognition should motivate us to preserve our own knowledge more carefully, to document and protect cultural diversity while we still can, to think about what future generations will need to know and to ensure that critical information is preserved in forms that can survive disasters and dark ages. The question of lost civilizations ultimately forces us to confront our own mortality, not just as individuals but as a civilization and as a species. We tend to assume that our current civilization is permanent, that progress is inevitable, that the knowledge we have accumulated will never be lost. But history tells us otherwise. Every previous civilization that made similar assumptions turned out to be wrong. The Romans surely thought their empire would last forever. The Mayans at the height of their power could not have imagined their cities would be abandoned and swallowed by jungle. The peoples of the Ice Age, if they did achieve a level of civilization we do not recognize, certainly would not have expected that their entire world would drown and that their very existence would be forgotten, surviving only in distorted myths that future generations would dismiss as fantasy. We are not exempt from the forces that destroyed previous civilizations. Our technology and knowledge make us powerful but also vulnerable, dependent on complex systems that could fail catastrophically if the conditions that support them change. Climate change, environmental degradation, resource depletion, pandemics, warfare, cosmic impacts, any of these could disrupt our civilization as thoroughly as rising seas disrupted Ice Age coastal societies. The question is not whether such disruptions could happen, but whether we will be wise enough to prepare for them and resilient enough to survive them. Returning to the myths and legends that have guided much of our exploration, we can now appreciate them in a new light, not as literal historical accounts, but as cultural memories that preserve important truths even when the specific details have been transformed. The flood myths found in cultures worldwide likely do reflect real experiences of catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age, distorted through thousands of years of retelling but maintaining the essential truth that the seas once rose dramatically and changed the world. The legends of lost advanced civilizations like Atlantis may preserve memories of actual sophisticated societies that were destroyed by flooding, even if the specific details Plato provides cannot be taken literally. The stories of gods and heroes who came from the sea and brought knowledge to humanity might reflect actual encounters with refugees from drowned coastal lands who taught inland populations what they knew. These myths matter not because they are accurate historical documents, but because they represent humanity's attempt to remember and make sense of traumatic events, to preserve warnings about catastrophes that could happen again, to maintain hope that knowledge lost can be recovered, and that civilizations destroyed can be rebuilt. The persistence of these myths across so many cultures and so many generations suggests that they serve deep psychological and social functions. They remind us that the world changes, that what seems permanent can be swept away, that we must be prepared for disasters and resilient in the face of loss. They preserve the memory of ancestors who survived catastrophes and rebuilt, providing role models for how to endure hardship and maintain purpose across generations. They encode warnings about the dangers of hubris and the importance of living in harmony with natural forces, rather than assuming we can control them. They maintain awareness that current knowledge and civilization are not guaranteed to last forever and must be actively preserved and passed on. In a sense, the myths are doing exactly what they are supposed to do, keeping alive important information and perspectives that purely factual historical records might miss. A dry archaeological report might tell us that sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age and coastal areas were submerged. A myth about a great flood that destroyed the world and forced survivors to start over conveys the same information but also captures the emotional and experiential reality of what it meant to live through such events, ensuring that the lesson resonates across generations. Modern civilization has largely abandoned mythological thinking in favor of scientific rationalism, which has brought enormous benefits in terms of understanding how the natural world works and developing technologies to improve human life. But in abandoning myth, we may have lost some wisdom about how to preserve knowledge across vast time spans and catastrophic disruptions. Scientific knowledge is powerful but also fragile, dependent on written records and technological infrastructure that could be lost if civilization collapses. Myths and oral traditions, while less precise, are more durable, capable of preserving information for thousands of years without requiring any technology beyond human memory and the capacity for storytelling. The Aboriginal Australians maintained accurate geographical knowledge for over 7,000 years through oral tradition alone, proving that information can be preserved across immense timescales without writing or technology. Perhaps we need to combine both approaches, using scientific methods to discover and verify knowledge, while also encoding that knowledge in mythological narratives that can survive disasters and be passed down through countless generations. The ancient peoples who encoded astronomical and mathematical knowledge in monuments and myths might have been wiser than we realize about how to preserve information for the long term. We stand at a unique moment in history when the technology finally exists to thoroughly explore the underwater landscapes that could hold evidence of lost civilizations. Satellite mapping can identify promising features on the ocean floor from space. Autonomous underwater vehicles can survey vast areas efficiently. Advanced diving equipment allows humans to work at greater depths for longer periods. DNA analysis can extract information from tiny fragments of ancient material. Radiocarbon dating and other techniques can precisely determine the age of artifacts and structures. Computing power allows researchers to analyze enormous data sets and identify patterns that would be invisible to the naked eye. All of these tools have been developed only in the last few decades, meaning that we are the first generation with the capability to seriously investigate the question of whether advanced civilizations existed during the Ice Age and left traces in the now submerged coastal zones. This is genuinely exciting because it means that discoveries that could transform our understanding of human history might be just around the corner, waiting for researchers with the right tools and persistence to find them. Several ambitious projects are already underway to search for evidence of human occupation on the submerged continental shelves. Researchers are using sonar to map the drowned river valleys and coastlines of the North Sea where Doggerland once existed, identifying areas that would have been attractive for human settlement and planning underwater excavations. Marine archaeologists are systematically exploring the submerged shorelines of the Mediterranean, where dozens of ancient ports and settlements have already been found, and many more likely remain undiscovered. Off the coasts of India, expeditions continue to investigate controversial structures that might represent very ancient urban sites. In the Americas, researchers are exploring submerged caves and sinkholes that were above water during the Ice Age and might contain evidence of early human presence. These projects face significant challenges, including limited funding, difficult working conditions, and the sheer vastness of the areas to be explored, but they are making progress and occasionally producing intriguing finds that hint at how much remains to be discovered. The next few decades could see major breakthroughs in our understanding of human prehistory as these underwater exploration efforts mature and expand. It is entirely possible that definitive evidence of sophisticated Ice Age settlements will be found on the submerged continental shelves, proving that humans were more advanced earlier than conventional archaeology has recognized. It is also possible that thorough exploration will reveal only evidence of simple hunter-gatherer camps, supporting the mainstream view that civilization did not develop until after the Ice Age ended. Either outcome would be valuable, either expanding our understanding of human capabilities, or confirming what we already believe with much greater certainty than we currently have. The important thing is that the questions are being seriously investigated using rigorous scientific methods rather than being dismissed without investigation or left entirely to speculation. The ocean is finally beginning to give up its secrets, and we have the tools to read what it has to tell us about our past. As this journey through the possibility of lost civilizations draws to a close, let the gentle rhythm of questions and wonders carry you into peaceful rest, knowing that the mystery of our origins is itself a kind of comfort, a reminder that the world is larger and deeper than we can fully know. Whether or not an advanced civilization truly sank beneath the waves at the end of the Ice Age, the exploration of this possibility has taken us through genuine history and real science, through geological transformations and climate catastrophes, through the resilience of human survivors and the persistence of cultural memory across vast spans of time. We have seen that sea levels did rise dramatically, drowning millions of square miles of coastal land that would have been prime territory for human settlement. We have seen that ancient peoples were more sophisticated than we often give them credit for, capable of building massive stone monuments, understanding astronomical phenomena, developing complex societies, and preserving knowledge across countless generations through oral tradition. We have seen that civilizations can collapse suddenly, losing accumulated knowledge and having to rebuild from fragments, making it entirely plausible that sophisticated prehistoric cultures could have existed and then vanished from history. The ocean keeps its secrets in the silent depths where light does not reach, in the sediments that cover what once was dry land, in the ruins that may lie scattered on the continental shelves waiting for explorers to find them. The evidence we have examined points towards something important that happened at the end of the Ice Age, something that affected human populations worldwide and left traces in myths and megalithic monuments and genetic patterns and cultural similarities that span continents. Whether that something was the destruction of an advanced coastal civilization, or simply the destruction of numerous hunter-gatherer populations by rising seas and climate change, it represents a chapter of human history that we have only begun to understand, a time of transformation and tragedy and resilience that shaped everything that came after. The survivors of those catastrophic floods, whoever they were and whatever they knew, are our ancestors, and their experiences are part of our heritage, calling to us across the ages with questions we are only now beginning to be able to answer. Sleep now with the knowledge that human history is deep and mysterious, that our ancestors endured challenges we can barely imagine and survived to pass their knowledge on to us, that the monuments they built still stand as testaments to their achievements and their determination to be remembered. Sleep with an appreciation for how much we do not know and how much remains to be discovered, for the underwater landscapes that hide their stories beneath the waves, for the oral traditions that preserve fragments of truth in mythological forms, for the persistence of questions that drive us to explore and understand. Sleep knowing that the search for lost civilizations is ultimately the search for ourselves, for understanding who we are by learning where we came from, for recognizing that we are part of a long story of human struggle and achievement that extends far beyond what we can consciously remember. The ocean holds its secrets still, but gradually, patiently, through the work of dedicated researchers and the advancement of technology, those secrets are being revealed, and the story of humanity grows richer and more complex with each discovery. Let the waves of time wash over you gently as you drift into dreams, carrying you back through the millennia to coasts that no longer exist, to civilizations that may have risen and fallen before history began, to ancestors who looked up at the same stars we see and wondered about their place in the cosmos just as we do. Let the mystery embrace you, not as something to solve before sleep comes, but as something to rest within, a comfortable uncertainty that acknowledges the limits of human knowledge while celebrating the human drive to question and explore and understand. The first civilization may indeed have sunk rather than fallen, may have been claimed by water rather than conquered by enemies, may lie beneath the ocean waiting to be found, or may exist only in the distorted memories preserved in ancient myths. Either way, the story is profound, a reminder that civilizations are mortal, that knowledge can be lost but also recovered, that humanity persists through catastrophes and rebuilds and reaches once again toward understanding and wisdom. Rest now in the embrace of this ancient story, this possibility that whispers from the depths, this suggestion that we are heirs to a longer and more complex history than we usually acknowledge. Rest knowing that whether or not specific claims about lost civilizations are proven true, the broader truth is undeniable. Human beings have been exploring and achieving and creating for far longer than written history records, have survived disasters that destroyed their worlds and forced them to start over, have preserved fragments of knowledge across vast gulfs of time through determination and ingenuity and hope. We stand on the shoulders of countless ancestors whose names we will never know, whose stories have been lost, whose achievements have crumbled or drowned or been forgotten, but whose legacy lives on in us, in the accumulated knowledge and cultural traditions and genetic inheritance that makes us who we are. The ocean's secret, whether it holds lost cities or only scattered artifacts, is ultimately a secret about ourselves, about human resilience and creativity, and the endless cycle of loss and recovery that defines our relationship with time. Sleep deeply now, letting the questions dissolve into peaceful darkness, trusting that the answers will emerge in their own time, that the ocean will gradually reveal what it knows, that the past will slowly come into focus as we develop better tools and ask better questions and explore more thoroughly. Sleep knowing that the journey of discovery continues, that each generation adds to our understanding, that the work of revealing human history is never complete but always unfolding. Sleep with gratitude for the ancestors who survived the floods and the catastrophes and passed their knowledge on, for the storytellers who preserved the myths through countless generations, for the researchers who dive into dark waters searching for traces of the past, for the dreamers who look at ancient monuments and wonder what knowledge might be encoded there, waiting to be decoded. The first civilization may have sank, not fell, may have been claimed by the ocean that gives life and takes it away, may have left only the faintest traces for us to find, but the search for understanding who they were and what they knew is itself a monument to the human spirit, a testament to our refusal to forget, our determination to recover what was lost and honor those who came before. Let this final thought carry you into sleep, that you are part of a story that stretches back through unimaginable time, that connects you to people who lived when the world was different, when continents were shaped differently and seas had not yet risen to their current levels, when megafauna still roamed and ice still covered vast territories, when humans were just beginning to discover what they might be capable of if they worked together and passed knowledge down through generations. You carry within you the legacy of all who survived all the catastrophes, all who rebuilt after everything was lost, all who looked at the ruins of what came before and determined to create something new. The ocean's secret is your secret, the mystery of where we came from and who we might have been, and what knowledge might yet be recovered from the depths of time. Rest in this mystery. Let it comfort rather than disturb you. Let it remind you that there is always more to discover, that the story is not finished, that humanity continues its long journey of understanding and achievement and loss and recovery, writing new chapters while slowly, patiently uncovering the chapters that were lost. Sleep now. The ocean keeps watch over its drowned lands and vanished peoples. The stars wheel overhead as they have for millions of years. The earth continues its ancient rhythms of change and transformation. And you, descendant of survivors, heir to lost and recovered wisdom, rest peacefully in the knowledge that you are part of something vast and ancient and ongoing, a story that began long before you and will continue long after, a tale of humanity reaching toward understanding despite darkness and disaster, preserving what can be preserved, recovering what was lost, and building always toward a future that honors the past while embracing the unknown. The first civilization may have sank beneath waves that still roll above their ruins, but the human spirit that built that civilization, whatever it was, lives on in you, in all of us, carrying forward the eternal work of creating meaning and preserving knowledge and reaching toward the light. Rest now. Sleep deeply. Dream of ancient coasts and drowned cities, of ancestors who knew things we have forgotten, of secrets the ocean holds in its deepest places, of knowledge waiting to be recovered, of connections across time that bind all humanity into one long story of survival and achievement and hope. The journey continues, even in sleep, even in dreams, even in the dark waters where memory and history dissolve into each other and become one.